The night descends and the world fades, but within the silent fortress of your skull a deeper world awakens. You believe you are at rest, an empty vessel adrift on the quiet sea of sleep. But what if the darkness is not empty? What if the door you lock each evening simply opens onto a terrifying corridor within your own mind? A shadow self that remembers the primordial fears of the species. Do you truly know what you become when the light of consciousness dims? Tonight, we step past the threshold of slumber, into the haunted cathedral of the unconscious, where the very boundary between myth and reality dissolves. We seek the whispers of the ancient fears, the echoes of the void, hidden within your deepest, most unguarded moments. This journey begins in the profound silence of the unthinking self, exploring 100 terrifying facts about the unconscious mind. We will uncover historical accounts, supernatural myths, and eerie truths that suggest our sleeping state is far more than mere biological necessity. We are searching for the dark forces or forgotten truths that connect these bizarre human behaviours across time, hinting at a shadowy presence lurking behind humanity's darkest moments. Prepare to ask, what secrets does your sleeping self keep from you? The rider of sleep paralysis. It is the oldest terror, the primal fear that transcends culture and century. To wake up trapped inside your own body, a prisoner watching a silent horror unfold. This chilling state, now labelled sleep paralysis, was once universally known as the visitation of a demon, a hag or a succubus, a physical entity with the weight of dread pressed upon your chest. Historical texts are filled with consistent accounts of this oppressive presence, suggesting that what we now call a neurological misfiring was once an undeniable, shared encounter with something malevolent and external. The horror lies not just in the immobility, but in the certain knowledge that you're being watched, or worse, ridden. The unconscious mind, having slipped its leash of logic, creates a shadow in the periphery that perfectly mimics human fear. These are not random spectres. They are often tall, cloaked figures or silent, monstrous eyes, recurring motifs across global folklore. Ancient physicians and medieval exorcists did not diagnose brain chemistry. They prescribed amulets, holy water, and iron to ward off the spirit that stole the breath and paralyzed the will. The chemical imbalance explanation offers comfort, but it fails to account for the symbolic uniformity of the attackers, hinting at an intelligence behind the veil. What if the terror is not the paralysis itself, but the moment the unconscious self, the one that holds the truth, is forced into silence by a deeper, older force? Sleep paralysis might be the brief window where the guard is down, and the true horrors lurking just beneath the surface of reality are permitted to breach the door. It is a terrifying glimpse into the hidden geometry of fear, confirming that while our bodies sleep, something else is actively haunting us, waiting for that moment of vulnerability to reveal itself. The whispering library of the hypnagogic state. The brief shimmering moment between waking and true sleep, known as the hypnagogic state, is a place where the mind begins to weave strange, fractured realities. You're no longer fully conscious, yet the world has not fully faded, leading to sudden, sharp hallucinations, voices whispering unknown languages, faces of strangers pressed close, or sudden, inexplicable flashes of light. These are the uncontrolled archives of the unconscious, violently throwing up images and sounds that have no logical place in your memory, suggesting the brain is accessing a shared library of humanity's sensory past. History often interpreted these intense, fleeting visions as the immediate messages of gods, or the cruel trickery of mischievous, low-level spirits attempting to confuse the soul on its journey to rest. Philosophers whispered that this state was the closest mortal man ever came to the cosmic truth, a point of pure, unfiltered knowledge before the conscious ego could impose its limitations. It suggests that our mind, when unconstrained, can speak to entities or access information that lies far beyond the realm of waking perception. Consider the strange paradox of clarity in this state. People report perfectly formed solutions to complex problems or entire, cohesive musical scores flashing into existence, only to vanish the moment they try to grasp them. It is as if the sleeping mind is a flawless computer, capable of synthesizing cosmic data instantly, yet its power is immediately severed upon the return of the narrow rational self. This fleeting perfection hints at a vast, terrifying potential hidden within us, a powerful intellect that must be kept dormant for the sanity of the everyday world. The hypnic jerk, a primordial fall. The sudden, violent jolt that rips you back from the edge of sleep, the feeling of falling from a terrible height, is a terrifying physiological echo known as the hypnic jerk. Though modern science attributes it to a harmless neurological firing as the brain shifts gears, ancient theories offered a far more suspenseful interpretation. This physical shock was believed to be the soul's desperate reflexive struggle to remain anchored in the body, resisting the call of an unknown abyss or a grasping hand reaching up from the earth. Mythology from various cultures is unified by the idea that sleep is a temporary death or a journey. The hypnic jerk becomes the moment the soul, having travelled too far or too close to the boundary between worlds, is yanked back just before the final fatal severing. It is the ancient evolutionary alarm system screaming that the predator is near, or that we have lost our grip on the branch of the tree, an ingrained terror that has never left our DNA, despite the comfort of our modern beds. The sheer biological uniformity of this experience, nearly every human feels this jolt, suggests it is a primal inheritance, a piece of prehistory still embedded in our nerves. What if the feeling of falling is not the body misfiring, but a genuine shared memory of a terrifying event endured by our ancient ancestors, perhaps a collective trauma now replaying in a terrifying loop across millennia? The hypnic jerk is a micro cliffhanger, reminding us that we are only moments away from a fall we can never truly survive. Somniloquy. Speaking to the dark. The innocent act of sleep-talking, or somniloquy, often dismissible as harmless babbling, takes on a chilling significance when viewed through the lens of history. Before the era of psychology, the sudden unintelligible whispers from a sleeping person were considered signs of possession, or the dreamer speaking directly to the spirits of the dead. It was believed that in the unguarded moment of sleep, the soul could not filter the malicious voices of the ether, allowing them to slip through and briefly seize control of the tongue. The content of sleep-talking is often nonsensical, yet sometimes it reveals secrets or speaks with a voice utterly unlike the dreamer's waking personality. This shift in cadence and content fueled the terrifying belief that a second, darker persona lives within, only gaining enough strength to speak when the conscious mind is deactivated. What if the words spoken in the dark are not random neurological garbage, but fragments of a hidden truth being delivered by the shadow self, a truth too horrific or too profound to be handled by the conscious mind? Consider the paradoxical phenomenon where sleepers respond perfectly to questions, or hold coherent, if fleeting, conversations while totally unconscious. This suggests a fully formed secondary consciousness that exists beneath the surface of the you that is awake. This hidden voice might be giving us crucial clues about the true ancient identity of the human psyche, an identity linked to fear, conspiracy, and an underlying darkness that has always been present in the species. The terrors of exploding head syndrome. Imagine the moment of drift, just as sleep claims you, when a sudden, impossible noise erupts within your skull, a deafening bang, a clash of cymbals, or the terrible sound of an unseen door slamming shut. This bizarre and frightening phenomenon, exploding head syndrome, feels violently physical, yet it originates entirely within the unconscious mind. It is a moment of profound sensory overload, a neurological shout that ancient cultures might have interpreted as a warning shot fired by the gods, or a nearby spirit violently breaking the fragile silence of the night. The unsettling nature of this internal blast lies in its sudden, unprovoked violence, suggesting a hidden mechanism within the brain capable of weaponizing sound. Before modern science offered its gentle label, such internal detonations were terrifying confirmation of spiritual warfare taking place just beyond the veil of perception. It was whispered that these were the sounds of dark entities fighting to breach the dreamer's consciousness, their failure signalled by the loud, reflexive jolt that ripped the sleeper back to the safety of waking life. This internal explosion serves as a dramatic physical manifestation of the boundary between wakefulness and sleep, a chaotic burst that enforces the separation. The sheer, auditory intensity, a sound that has no real-world source, hints at the incredible raw power contained within the sleeping brain, a power usually regulated and contained by the conscious self. What dark, suppressed energy is released in that single violent moment? And what secrets does that sudden silence hide once the echo fades? The historical fear of buried alive, the primal, chilling terror of being buried alive, or taphophobia, was a very real, documented fear that dominated the unconscious anxieties of the 18th and 19th centuries. Before reliable medical testing, periods of deep coma, fainting, or the deep sleep of disease were often mistaken for death, leading to documented cases of accidental premature burial. This constant threat gave rise to sophisticated Gothic burial alarms and safety coffins, designed with mirrors, ropes, and bells, a testament to the era's deep-seated horror of awakening in the ultimate confinement. This pervasive societal dread entered the collective unconscious, manifesting in horrifying dreams that focused on themes of crushing weight, restricted breath, and silent screams, the ultimate nightmare of helplessness. The fear became a cultural motif, a psychological pressure cooker, where the lack of movement and air symbolized the ultimate loss of freedom and identity. It is a haunting reflection of how the collective human anxiety can sculpt the inner landscape of the sleeping mind, imposing universal themes of inescapable doom upon individual slumber. Yet this fear might be more than simple medical anxiety. It touches upon the existential dread of being entombed not in earth, but in one's own unconsciousness. To be buried alive is to be silent while fully aware, a chilling mirror to the paralysis of sleep, where the mind screams but the body will not obey. The existence of historical safeguards serves as a disturbing reminder that the boundary between the waking self and the eternal dark is terribly, unnervingly thin, capable of swallowing the living whole. The unconscious mind and precognition. Throughout recorded history, the most revered and feared aspect of the sleeping mind was its alleged ability to glimpse the future, the unsettling certainty of precognitive dreams. From the biblical warnings of pharaohs to the documented premonitions of historical figures, the dreaming state was viewed not as a passive period of rest, but as a psychic antenna, tuning into the currents of time beyond the confines of linear consciousness. This suggests that the unconscious mind operates outside our strict human understanding of cause and effect. The mechanism was believed to be spiritual, that during sleep, the soul partially detached and could freely commune with the Akashic records or the ultimate source of knowledge, returning with fragments of the future. While modern science dismisses these accounts as confirmation bias, the sheer volume of detailed, historically verified precognitive dreams, especially those foretelling large-scale disasters or deaths, suggests a terrifying potential. What if the mind is capable of observing time as a solid, fixed landscape, a knowledge we are shielded from during wakefulness for our own sanity? If the unconscious can truly see what is coming, then it holds the terrible cosmic knowledge of every future failure, every disaster, and the moment of every death. This places the sleeping self in a unique and terrifying position, a silent, knowing oracle trapped within a body that lives only in the moment. The dream state, then, is not rest, but the moment the mind shoulders the full, crushing weight of fate and the cosmic certainty of inevitable endings. The shadowed ethics of sleepwalking. The phenomenon of somnambulism, or sleepwalking, pushes the limits of human identity and moral responsibility, presenting a terrifying philosophical puzzle. When a person executes complex actions, driving, cooking, even committing acts of violence, while completely unconscious, who is truly in control? History grappled with this, often attributing these actions to demonic coercion or a momentary absence of the soul, leaving the body vulnerable to manipulation by malicious spirits seeking to carry out their dark purposes. Legal systems across history have struggled to assign guilt to the sleepwalker, acknowledging the profound disconnect between the waking ethical self and the silent mechanical operator of the night. This suggests the existence of a dark twin, an autonomous shadow self capable of fully navigating the waking world with deadly efficiency, yet devoid of moral consideration or memory. It is the ultimate confirmation that we are not singular beings, but complex structures haunted by an unconscious entity that only emerges under the cover of darkness. What if the sleepwalker is simply performing the acts the conscious mind most desperately suppresses during the day? The desires, the angers, the urges for chaos. The sleepwalker becomes a puppet for the hidden horrors of the subconscious, an involuntary participant in a secret life. The eerie stillness of the sleepwalker's eyes and the robotic precision of their movements remind us that the self we rely on is only a surface layer, easily peeled back to reveal a cold, focused stranger beneath. The ritual of the dream incubators. Ancient civilizations, most notably the Greeks, did not wait for dreams to happen naturally. They actively sought them out through ritual and architecture in sacred places called dream incubators or abatons. These temples, dedicated to the healing god Asclepius, were not hospitals, but spiritual corridors where the sick would sleep on the floors, hoping that the god would appear in a dream to reveal the secret cure or truth. This practice speaks to a profound belief that the unconscious mind was the sole medium for divine, life-saving communication. The process itself was a frightening submission. The patient was often prepared with fasting and purification rituals, deliberately lowering their body's resistance to create a state of extreme suggestibility, inviting the divine or the demonic into their sleep. The success of the dream cure was often recorded, suggesting that the power of belief, channeled through the focused intensity of the unconscious mind, could initiate physical healing, or perhaps terrifyingly manifest psychosomatic illness if the wrong entity was invited. The very existence of these temples confirms a widespread historical understanding that the boundary between the mortal and the divine, between health and sickness, lay in the depths of slumber. It turns the act of sleeping into a profound, terrifying gamble, where one risks possession or death for the chance of supernatural intervention. This ancient ritual reminds us that the unconscious is a powerful, sacred space, a doorway we were once taught to approach with reverence and extreme caution. The unwaking echo of the coma. The coma, a terrifying state of profound unconsciousness, represents the ultimate physical severance from the waking world, yet the mind often continues to operate in silent, unknown dimensions. Historical accounts often refer to coma patients as being taken or visited by the ferryman, their bodies remaining while their souls wander the underworld or a parallel realm. This interpretation instilled a chilling dread, as it suggested the person was not merely sick, but actively traversing a supernatural landscape we cannot perceive. Modern reports confirm the horror. Patients, upon waking, sometimes recall hearing conversations or experiencing terrifying abstract dimensions of light and sound, suggesting a persistent awareness trapped within a non-responsive shell. This state is the ultimate psychological prison, the soul screaming silently behind unbreakable glass. It is a chilling proof that consciousness, the thing that defines us, can be reduced to a powerless echo, fully aware of its helplessness while the body decays or the world continues without it. This raises the profound, terrifying question: when the mind is fully separated from the senses and the motor controls, what remains? Does the unconscious self finally become pure, unadulterated thought, free to contemplate its own ending and the secrets of the void? The coma is a forced sabbatical into the absolute unknown, a living metaphor for being buried alive, where the only connection to reality is the faint, terrifying whisper of sound leaking through the vast, dark silence. The ancient curse of sleep paralysis figures. Returning to the deepest fear, the figures seen during sleep paralysis are not random projections. They are unnervingly consistent across cultures and millennia. The shadow person is a near-universal motif, tall, dark, featureless, and often wearing a broad-brimmed hat or a cloak. This figure is interpreted historically as a messenger of death, a minor demon, or the literal manifestation of pure, predatory darkness, confirming the persistence of fear across time. This shared imagery suggests that the unconscious mind is tapping into a common, non-physical source of terror, a universal symbolic presence. If the phenomenon were purely internal, the spectres would vary wildly. Yet the recurring motif of the cloaked observing figure argues for an entity that is either archetypal or real, a dark signature recognized by the sleeping self globally. It is the persistent, unnerving proof that the things we fear most have a unified shape, suggesting a single, pervasive threat. What forces organize this collective nightmare, ensuring that the same chilling image appears to an ancient Roman as it does to a modern city dweller? The shadow person becomes a recurring motif, a symbolic image that hints at the larger supernatural conspiracy driving the series. It is a piece of the central question revealing itself, a silent observer whose very existence connects all the disparate historical horrors we are seeking to unravel. The symbolic blood-red moon of insomnia. Chronic insomnia, the inability to find peace in unconsciousness, was not simply considered a medical problem. It was often seen as a curse or a sign of divine disfavour, trapping the mind in a perpetual, exhausting wakefulness. The moon, often depicted as a blood-red moon during this time, became a recurring motif symbolising the terrible vigilance of the sleepless, staring endlessly into the dark void. This sleeplessness was thought to weaken the boundary between the living and the dead, making the afflicted highly susceptible to spectral visitation. The historical cure for insomnia often involved complicated rituals designed to appease angered spirits or break a magical enchantment, believing the sleeplessness was a direct attack on the soul's integrity. To be awake when the rest of the world slept was to be placed outside the natural order, leaving one vulnerable to the things that move only in the shadows and silence. It is a frightening contrast between the rest of the world and the lone terrified watcher. The persistence of this affliction across time highlights a deeper psychological conflict, the unconscious desperately fighting to keep the conscious self awake, perhaps to prevent the terrible journey the sleeping self must undertake. The perpetual exhaustion of the insomniac is the price paid for guarding the mind's door against the darkness, a lonely, terrifying vigil. The blood-red moon is their symbolic flag, marking them as having seen too much and being permanently bound to the night. The unconscious mind as historical interrogator. During times of political and religious conflict, the secrets revealed by the unconscious mind were actively sought, leading to the terrifying practice of using dreams as a method of historical interrogation. It was believed that a person's sleeping mind, free of the conscious will to lie, would reveal hidden treasons, heresies, or secret knowledge. Individuals would be coerced into sharing their dreams, which were then interpreted by authorities, often with fatal consequences, as absolute truthful confessions of guilt. This practice instilled a terrifying societal fear that the mind, even in its most vulnerable state, was never safe from the scrutiny of power. It transformed the act of sleeping from a refuge into a potential trap, where one's own imagination could be weaponized against them. The dreamer became an unwitting informant, their private subconscious twisted into public evidence, proving that the deepest horrors often stem not from supernatural sources, but from the cruel machinations of humanity itself. The historical record is scarred by accounts of those executed based on the erratic, symbolic, or nonsensical content of their dreams, demonstrating the profound trust once placed in the veracity of the unconscious. This era of fear established a lasting paradox, that the self you cannot control holds the keys to your destruction. It is a chilling metaphor for the way the unconscious mind constantly holds evidence against the conscious self, patiently waiting for the moment to betray the carefully constructed facade of identity. The paradox of the night. Terrors. Night terrors are a terrifying paradox. Unlike ordinary nightmares, the sufferer awakens screaming, heart-pounding, yet holds no memory of the terror that caused the reaction. It is a purely emotional explosion, the ultimate distillation of fear without narrative. Ancient cultures often viewed these screaming episodes as the victim's soul being momentarily tortured by unseen entities in a parallel dimension, with the physical screams being the only echo that crosses back into our reality. The sheer physical violence of the event, thrashing, sweating, panicked eyes, suggests that the unconscious mind is reacting to a danger so profound that it overrides all systems of the body. The terror is immediate, consuming, and so primal it bypasses the parts of the brain that create memory and logic. This terrifying intensity supports the theory that the unconscious is experiencing a real, present danger that exists outside the bounds of the comfortable waking world. This absence of memory is the most chilling aspect, suggesting that the self that experienced the horror is utterly alien to the self that wakes up screaming. The mind constructs a temporary barrier, a psychological amnesia, to protect the conscious self from the truth of what it saw or endured in the other realm. The night terror is a foreshadowing of ultimate fear, a brief, violent demonstration of the utter chaos that awaits the soul when its defences are breached by the persistent horrors that lurk just beyond the periphery. The cursed artifacts of the sleeping mind. The unconscious mind is profoundly susceptible to suggestion, making it the perfect target for objects of occult power. History is replete with accounts of haunted or cursed artifacts, statues, lockets, or ancient books, that are said to specifically invade the dreams of their owners, forcing disturbing visions or driving them toward madness. This suggests that the unconscious mind can be subtly programmed or spiritually polluted simply through prolonged exposure to an object charged with malevolent intent. These artifacts act as keys to dark truths, symbolically unlocking the deepest fears in the sleeper. The curse is often not physical but psychological, targeting the dreamer's inner world, leading to a breakdown of the boundary between myth and reality. This phenomenon proves that the vulnerability of the sleeping self is well known to those who practice the occult, who seek to gain power not through physical force, but through the subtle, corrupting influence of the nightmare. The fact that so many diverse historical artifacts share this power to pollute the dream state points back to the central question: what shadowy force connects this history of horror? It suggests an unseen network of influence operating through symbolic imagery and shared motifs, using the unconscious mind as the ultimate point of access. The curse remains long after the object is destroyed, because the true horror is planted not in the artifact itself, but in the vulnerable darkness of the human mind. The cryptic language of tooth grinding. The unconscious action of bruxism, or severe tooth grinding during sleep, was historically interpreted not as a dental issue, but as a visceral sign of the soul's internal suffering, or a physical manifestation of an external spiritual battle. Medieval physicians often believed that the grinding was caused by internal demons, the patient's spirit attempting to grind the demonic presence out of their body in a desperate, silent struggle. It became a terrifying physical symptom of unseen spiritual duress. This constant, unconscious gnashing of teeth suggests that the mind, when released from conscious control, is overwhelmed by an agonizing, unexpressed tension that can only be released through destructive physical force. What unspeakable anxieties or hidden horrors is the sleeping self struggling to contain that demands such a violent, grinding release? It is a disturbing echo of the soul's fight, suggesting a creature trapped inside the skull scraping against its confinement in a terrifying rhythmic pattern. The sound itself, a harsh, rhythmic scraping heard only in the dead of night, lent credence to the idea of a nocturnal visitor. It became a signal to superstitious families that the sleeping relative was under spiritual attack, turning the bedroom into a battleground where the only weapon was the relentless wearing down of bone. The ruined teeth were simply the physical evidence of the night's silent psychic conflict, a visible wound from an invisible war. The ancient fear of the waking dream, one of the most profound terrors of the unconscious mind, is the experience of the waking dream, or lucid dreaming, which was interpreted by mystics and ancient philosophers as a dangerous blurring of the divine and the mortal. To be aware that you are dreaming, yet still fully immersed in the dreamscape, was seen as accidentally crossing a boundary, the soul stepping outside the safety of the natural order and into the territory of the gods or the dead. The peril of the lucid dream, historically, was the fear that the dreamer might become trapped in the parallel reality, permanently severed from the physical body. It was thought that by gaining conscious control, the dreamer risked drawing the attention of powerful, malevolent dream entities who resented the intrusion. This state of hyper-awareness in an unreal landscape was not liberation, but a terrifying exposure to the pure, unedited chaos of the subconscious void. The ancient texts warned that the knowledge gained in these fully conscious dreams was often too potent, too cosmic, or too morally corrupting for the waking mind to bear, leading to madness or spiritual ruin. The waking dream is the ultimate spy mission into the dark territory of the self, a place where the rules of reality are fluid and the forces encountered are entirely unpredictable, leaving the dreamer forever tainted by the terrible truths they chose to observe. The unseen watcher of autopilot driving. The modern phenomenon of autopilot driving, travelling a familiar route while the conscious mind drifts into deep thought or a semi-hypnotic state, is a chilling demonstration of the unconscious mind's competency. This suggests a secondary, hyper-vigilant consciousness that can navigate complex situations, follow rules, and avoid disaster, all without the input of the self we recognise. History might have interpreted this as the body being temporarily steered by a benevolent familiar spirit or a protective ancestral presence. Yet the idea of this unseen watcher steering us, making flawless decisions while the conscious self is elsewhere, is profoundly unsettling. What terrifying knowledge does this secondary self possess? Does it remember the primal instinct for survival that the rational mind has lost? This automatic state exposes a startling vulnerability. The body can function perfectly without the mind's permission, meaning the control we cherish is merely an illusion covering a deeper, automated layer. This highway hypnosis becomes a modern metaphor for the ancient belief in temporary possession, where the driver awakens with a shocking jolt, realizing they have travelled miles without recollection. It is a frightening realization that we can entrust our lives to a silent, unseen operator whose intentions and identity remain completely unknown. This automatic self is a cold, calculating machine that sacrifices identity for raw survival, the hidden puppet master within the bones. The myth of the sleep debt collector. Historically, the concept of sleep debt, the cumulative effect of lost sleep, was not viewed as a biological necessity, but as a karmic or spiritual deficit that demanded a terrifying repayment. Cultures believed that the debt was collected by a malevolent entity, a sleep debt collector, who would exact the toll not through simple fatigue, but through nightmarish visitations, spiritual depletion, or even the theft of waking memory and creativity. The forced sleep, the involuntary falling asleep due to severe exhaustion, was interpreted as the moment the collector finally sees the body, taking the soul on a horrific, unavoidable journey to pay the price. The sheer disorientation and confusion upon waking were thought to be the side effects of having briefly traversed a chaotic, non-human realm where the rules of time and identity were utterly broken. It turns exhaustion into a terrifying spiritual transaction. This mythological framework imbues ordinary fatigue with profound dread. It implies that every moment of lost sleep is recorded by an unseen accountant, leading to a climactic moment of terrifying surrender. The extreme need for sleep becomes a vulnerability, a sign of weakness that the forces of the night exploit to draw the conscious self into their orbit. The debt is always paid, and the receipt is always a memory that is too strange or too dark to fully comprehend. REM, sleep and the hidden violence. The state of REM sleep, where dreams are most vivid, and the body is nearly paralyzed, reveals the sheer, terrifying power of the mind's hidden violence. Though the dreamer is physically still, the brain is often creating elaborate scenarios of conflict, pursuit, and chaos. A silent internal war that the body is prevented from acting out by a necessary neurological shutdown. This paralysis, atonia, is the single barrier protecting the waking world from the true, unfettered savagery of the unconscious. When the mechanism of atonia fails, leading to REM sleep behavior disorder, the internal violence spills into the external world. The sleeper screams, thrashes and punches, acting out the dream's intensity with shocking physical force. This proves that the unconscious, when unchained, is capable of profound unthinking aggression, suggesting that the dream world is not merely a theatre for memory, but a training ground for primal survival-driven chaos. What dark impulses are constantly rehearsed in the dream state that require such a rigorous physical shutdown? The sleeping mind seems compelled to process violence, to reenact ancient conflicts, or perhaps to simply practice survival in a world that is always under threat. This hidden violence suggests that the conscious, civilized self is merely a thin layer covering a deeper, savage core that is only unleashed when the protective layer of waking awareness is finally dissolved. The secret life of the unconscious healer, the unconscious mind, has long been believed to possess a secret, autonomous intelligence capable of healing the body, a hidden physician that works only in the dark silence of sleep. Ancient temples and folk traditions emphasize that true recovery from illness began only after the patient succumbed to a deep, restorative slumber, believing that the spirit was then able to communicate with the body's hidden wisdom. This suggests a powerful, autonomous system we can only access when conscious control is surrendered. This hidden healer works by mobilizing the body's defenses, speeding cellular repair, and fighting unseen battles against disease. The sheer effort and focus required by this unconscious work explain the profound, necessary surrender of sleep. It is a terrifying realization that the conscious self often interferes with this natural, internal wisdom, proving that ultimate health is achieved only when we let go of our waking control and trust the inner mechanism we do not fully understand. Yet this healer can also be corrupted. If the unconscious mind is saturated with fear, the healing process stalls, or worse, turns inward, manifesting psychosomatic illnesses that are just as real as physical ones. This implies that the hidden physician holds the keys not only to profound wellness but also to ultimate self-destruction. The power of the unconscious is absolute, capable of either restoring the fortress or tearing it down from within, making sleep a terrifying, high-stakes gamble. The dissociative terror of fugue states. The psychological phenomenon of the dissociative fugue state is one of the most terrifying proofs of the fragmented self. In this state, a person suddenly travels far from home, assumes a completely new identity, and creates an entirely new life, only to awaken weeks or months later with no memory of their actions. The historical explanation often involved a vengeful spirit possessing the person's body and soul, driving them away to enact a secret, unknown purpose. The fugue state represents the ultimate betrayal of the unconscious mind. The true self is temporarily evicted, replaced by a dark, efficient alter persona who is free to rewrite the narrative of the life with complete impunity. This proves that a secondary, powerful identity is always lurking beneath the surface, fully capable of seizing control and executing complex, life-altering plans without the consent or memory of the original host. When the host awakens, the memory gap is absolute, leaving behind only the chilling evidence of the other self's actions, the new job, the new apartment, the new relationships. The true horror lies in the realization that this powerful, unbidden self is still in there, waiting for the right moment of stress or vulnerability to re-emerge and continue its dark, unknown mission. The fugue state is the ultimate demonstration of the mind's internal treachery. The unconscious mind and post-hypnotic suggestion. The power of post-hypnotic suggestion reveals the terrifying fact that the unconscious mind can be programmed to perform specific actions days or weeks after the suggestion is planted without the conscious mind being aware of the instruction or the motivation. Historically, this power was equated with magical enchantment, or a subtle long-distance spell that turned a person into an unknowing automaton, capable of executing tasks against their own will. This ability to implant a command in the subconscious proves that the mind is fundamentally vulnerable to external control when its rational defenses are lowered. The person acts with complete conviction, fully believing the action is their own idea when it is in fact the culmination of a planted seed. The consciousness acts merely as the body's delivery mechanism, demonstrating the fragility of free will when faced with a targeted attack on the deepest level of the psyche. The chilling implication is that we may already be acting upon long-forgotten instructions or deeply buried societal commands without knowing their true origin. The unconscious mind becomes a terrifying repository of external suggestions, a vulnerable landscape easily manipulated by anyone who knows the precise language of control. It turns the human being into a beautifully efficient yet completely programmable machine, capable of self-destruction at the command of an unseen master. The eerie phenomenon of sleep driving. Perhaps the most terrifying of all sleep disorders is sleep driving, where the sleeper awakens miles away from home, behind the wheel of a moving vehicle with absolutely no memory of the journey. This bizarre and deadly behavior illustrates the ultimate autonomy of the shadow self, a dangerous entity capable of piloting a machine at high speed while the conscious mind is utterly absent and defenseless. It is the ultimate expression of the somnambulist's dark potential. This chilling act goes far beyond simple sleepwalking. It proves that the unconscious can successfully execute a long chain of complex life-threatening decisions, starting the car, navigating traffic, avoiding obstacles, all without the intervention of a logic or self-preservation. It is a moment of pure, focused, unthinking competency, guided by an unknown internal compulsion, suggesting a mission or goal the conscious mind is simply not permitted to access or recall. The moment of awakening, the sudden, terrifying realization of movement and speed, is the ultimate existential jolt, where the dreamer is handed back control of a situation already spiraling toward disaster. The sleep driver's journey is a modern metaphor for the ancient myth of the soul's involuntary pilgrimage to the underworld, a place they were forced to go, yet cannot remember. The physical evidence of the mileage travelled serves as the chilling proof of the night's deadly, uninvited passenger. The unseen force of shared dreams. The phenomenon of shared dreams, where two individuals recount experiencing the same precise events, imagery or narrative while sleeping separately, challenges our very understanding of the individual mind. History interpreted this as a profound spiritual convergence, suggesting that the sleeper's souls momentarily merged or were guided to the same specific location in the collective dream world by a powerful external entity or force seeking to transmit a unified message. The sheer statistical improbability of two minds generating the exact same complex narrative suggests that the dream content is not internal, but is being broadcast from a singular, powerful source. It turns the dreamscape into a communal viewing experience, a shared psychic channel that only the most sensitive unconscious minds can tune into. This collective experience offers compelling evidence for a powerful organizing force that manipulates human perception on a fundamental nightly basis. What truth is so potent, so essential to the collective unconscious, that it requires dual transmission to ensure its permanence? The possibility of a shared dream implies that the individual mind is not hermetically sealed, but is a permeable membrane connected to a vast chaotic network. This connection makes every sleeper a potential informant or a witness to a universal terrifying event that the waking world is designed to ignore. The whispers of the collective unconscious. The concept of the collective unconscious suggests a deep, inherited layer of the mind shared by all humanity, containing the memories, fears, and symbolic archetypes of our entire species. This is not simply a shared library of knowledge, but a terrifying living historical archive of primal violence, ancient betrayals, and species-wide trauma that every sleeping person must inevitably wander through. It implies that we are not individuals, but merely temporary vessels for an ancient, all-knowing entity. Accessing this collective space during dreams means facing the raw, unfiltered terrors of humanity's past, the nightmares of the cave dwellers, the dread of the plague victims, and the silent screams of those unjustly sacrificed. The strange, universal symbols found in dreams, the dark forest, the winding path, the gaping void, are not metaphors. They are the actual recurring landmarks of this inherited, terrifying mental landscape. The fear lies in the sheer power of this inherited self. The collective unconscious holds the secrets of every conspiracy, every dark act, and every primal fear that has ever haunted mankind. When our individual consciousness fades, we are absorbed back into this vast, turbulent sea of history, momentarily losing our identity to the dark, unified knowledge of the species. The goal of the night is not rest, but survival against the weight of all human memory. The body's memory of the hypnic jerk. Revisiting the hypnic jerk, ancient theories connected the sudden physical spasm to the primal trauma of falling from the trees, suggesting a powerful, embedded evolutionary memory. This involuntary spasm is the nervous system's lightning-fast check for danger, a relic of a time when the difference between life and death was holding onto a single branch. This terrifying response proves the body remembers danger far better than the conscious mind. The jolt is not a malfunction, but a necessary automatic alarm that screams to the soul that it is in danger, even when safely tucked in a modern bed. It suggests that the environment of safety is an illusion, and the body's deepest, most ancient consciousness still perceives the world as a terrifying, chaotic forest filled with unseen nocturnal predators. The hypnic jerk is a nightly reminder that we're only 1 millisecond away from total catastrophe. This physical echo of the past implies a profound disjunction. The mind believes it's safe, but the unconscious body is perpetually ready for battle or flight. The terrifying certainty of the spasm highlights the body's refusal to trust the modern, constructed world, preferring to rely on a million-year-old defense system. This physical trauma is the nightly price paid for the illusion of civilization, a constant quick burst of pure, unadulterated fear. The symbolic ritual of snoring. The act of snoring, often seen as a harmless domestic annoyance, was historically given far darker symbolic meaning, specifically that the loud, rattling sound was a deliberate protective ritual. Ancient folklore suggested that the sound was the sleeping soul's attempt to ward off minor nocturnal spirits, or to create a boundary of noise that prevented malicious entities from approaching the silent, vulnerable sleeper. The snoring became a crude, physical form of spiritual defense. The varied intensity and rhythm of the snore were interpreted as the level of the internal conflict. A light snore meant the spirits were distant, while a loud, choking rattle suggested a fierce, immediate struggle against a powerful entity attempting to enter the body through the mouth. The sheer physicality of the sound suggests an energy being deliberately spent by the unconscious to protect the sleeping vessel from intrusion, demonstrating a hidden, constant vigilance. This historical view transforms the snorer from an annoyance into an unwitting nocturnal sentinel, a noisy alarm system against the things that move silently in the dark. The silence of the non-snorer was, paradoxically, often viewed with suspicion, as it implied an easy, passive surrender to the night's forces. The unconscious mind, in its bizarre wisdom, uses the most primal sound, the laboured, guttural breath, as a sonic shield against the terrifying, pervasive silence of the void. The unconscious mind and symbolic madness. In the history of psychiatry, the dream was often seen as a terrifying, temporary excursion into madness, a nightly demonstration of the chaos and absurdity the waking mind desperately suppresses. The random, violent, or nonsensical leaps in dream logic were viewed as the soul succumbing to a temporary symbolic insanity, a complete breakdown of rational thought before the return of the morning light. This view implied that madness was not an illness, but a proximity to the raw truth of the unconscious. The fear was that prolonged or intense periods of dreaming could permanently taint the waking mind, leaving fragments of that chaos behind, a lingering fear, a misplaced memory, or a sudden, illogical obsession. The dream world acts as a spiritual contaminant, a place so unhinged from reality that mere exposure risks permanent damage to the delicate structure of the conscious self. The mind's nightly plunge into chaos is a necessary, terrifying cleansing ritual. This suggests that the terrifying content of nightmares, the impossible geometries, the endless falling, the pursuing horrors, is not unique to the dream, but is the underlying absolute truth of the universe, a truth the conscious mind is simply too fragile to accept. The act of sleeping becomes a journey into symbolic madness, a dangerous flirtation with the void, from which the self must be forcibly and carefully recalled before it is utterly consumed by the chaos. The ancient power of dream interpretation. The art of dream interpretation, or aneromancy, was historically not a psychological tool, but a crucial political and religious device, a terrifying means of extracting divine will or predicting catastrophic historical events. Priests and kings relied on professional interpreters to translate the cryptic language of the unconscious, believing the symbolism held the literal fate of empires and the hidden plans of the gods. The dream became the single most dangerous yet vital piece of intelligence available. This reliance on dream interpretation instilled a terrifying sense of instability. The fate of the entire civilization could hang on the nonsensical images from a single person's slumber. This placed immense and often deadly pressure on both the dreamer and the interpreter, where a misread symbol could lead to war, famine, or the execution of the dreamer for perceived treachery. The unconscious mind was seen as holding a power too great for any one person to safely possess. The historical obsession with deciphering the dream code proves a profound and enduring belief that the sleeping self speaks a universal, absolute language of truth. The symbols, the snake, the well, the veiled woman, are the recurring motifs of our terror and hope, a secret code written by the collective unconscious itself. Decoding these symbols is a desperate attempt to find the singular, absolute truth that is forever hidden just beneath the surface of the waking world. The unconscious as a lie detector. One of the most profound truths about the unconscious mind is its inability to lie. The truth is always recorded, always present, regardless of the conscious mind's efforts to suppress it. Historical methods of interrogation, often involving exhaustion or drug-induced slumber, sought to exploit this profound vulnerability, forcing the sleeping self to betray the secrets the conscious self was determined to keep. The unconscious mind is the ultimate inescapable witness to every dark action. The simple physiological response to a secret, a change in breathing, a minute muscle tension, a shift in heart rate, proves that the body knows the truth even when the mind attempts to conceal it. The unconscious mind is the body's historian, incapable of forgetting or altering the record of past events, acting as a tireless, silent judge that keeps perfect, damning evidence against the individual's conscious facade of innocence. This terrifying honesty means that the individual is never truly alone with a secret. The truth is always there, waiting in the darkness for its moment to be revealed through a slip of the tongue, a nervous tic, or the content of a nightmare. The unconscious mind is an internal enemy, a repository of undeniable evidence that awaits the moment of surrender. It is the final, inescapable accountability for every hidden horror the conscious self has ever committed. The primal terror of the nightmare. The term nightmare itself originates from the ancient Germanic belief in the nightmare, a female spirit or demon that literally sat on the sleeper's chest, crushing the breath and inducing terrifying visions. This mythological figure is the most direct, physically violent interpretation of the common sleep paralysis event, emphasizing that the terror was external, conscious, and motivated by pure malice. This belief system transformed the simple bad dream into a direct physical spiritual assault. The mare was often described as being associated with tangled hair, ropes, or knots, symbolizing the entanglement of the spirit in the physical world, unable to escape the creature's crushing weight. The physical oppression was seen as the mare literally draining the life and will from the victim, leaving them weak and frightened upon waking, with the terrifying certainty that they had just fought for their soul against a physical antagonist. This ancient fear is a crucial recurring motif, confirming that the visual and sensory experience of sleep paralysis is a deeply ingrained, universally shared human terror. The nightmare provides a terrifying physical face for the shadow person, a malicious presence whose existence is attested to by centuries of consistent accounts of suffocation and crushing weight. It proves that the deepest fears often have a single, recognizable, and ancient source. The haunting of the absent self. The chilling feeling of being haunted by one's own absence is explored through the unconscious mechanism of autoscopy, or the experience of seeing one's own body from an external perspective. Historically, this was interpreted as the soul beginning its final journey, floating above the body in preparation for death, leaving the physical form vulnerable to being seized by an outside entity. The fear was that the spirit might return to find the body already occupied by a demonic squatting presence. This sensation of witnessing the self from afar confirms a fundamental, terrifying duality, that the essence of self is separable from the physical container. To look down upon one's own unconscious body is to see the empty house, the vacant shell, proving that the identity is not physical, but an ethereal energy that can drift and observe. The quiet, cold stillness of the body below becomes a terrifying object of scrutiny. The horror of autoscopy is the chilling recognition that the conscious self is not essential to the body's survival. The body can remain a still, cold artifact, while the true identity is adrift and observing. This experience is a profound foreshadowing of death, a brief moment of self-funeral, where the conscious mind is forced to contemplate its own quiet demise and the potential theft of its empty vessel by a darker, waiting force. The unconscious mind and symbolic cannibalism. The unconscious mind's obsession with consumption, especially in the most unsettling and taboo ways, suggests a terrifying, primal hunger that rational thought attempts to suppress. Dreams featuring symbolic cannibalism, the eating of parts of the self, or consuming loved ones are recurring nightmares that mystics believed represented the spiritual act of absorbing the power, knowledge, or life essence of others. It is the ultimate expression of the self's terrifying, consuming greed. This violent consumption, though only enacted in the dream, hints at the dark, insatiable core of the human ego, the primal need to devour others to ensure one's own survival or ascendancy. The symbolic act reveals a latent savagery, a fundamental truth about human nature that is only allowed freedom when the conscious restraints are dissolved in slumber. The shame and horror upon waking is the recognition of that powerful latent internal monster. The presence of such universally reviled content in the unconscious speaks to the terrifying historical memory of scarcity and desperation, where such acts were once the ultimate unspeakable truth of survival. The mind reenacts the trauma not for memory, but for practice, confirming that the potential for ultimate atrocity is still wired into the species. The nightmare is a dark rehearsal for the end of civilization, proving the savage is always waiting beneath the veneer of culture. The eerie silence of the final dream. The moment of death, or the final drift into unconsciousness, was historically believed to be preceded by a single, profound, often comforting final dream. This dream was seen as the soul's last, personal communication from the universe, a silent vision designed to prepare the spirit for the ultimate severance. The eerie stillness and quietude reported by those near death suggest a moment of intense internal focus, where all external reality is finally discarded. The profound silence of this final dream is the most terrifying element, a complete absence of the world's noise, where the mind is left alone with only its deepest, most fundamental truths. What secrets are revealed in that last solitary moment, and why is the experience so often reported as serene, despite the finality of the act? It hints at an ultimate comforting knowledge that is only accessible when the fear of the conscious self is finally extinguished. This final, shared experience suggests an ultimate universal script for death, a pre-written dream that guides the spirit across the threshold. The unconscious mind, always the body's protector, offers a final, gentle lie before the final terror. This silent surrender is the ultimate act of trust, proving that the deepest core of the self knows precisely where it is going, a destination it has been rehearsing for in every single sleep since birth, the ritual of sleeping on historical ground. Ancient Roman and Celtic traditions included the terrifying ritual of deliberately sleeping on battlefields, in ruined cities, or in sacred forgotten crypts. This was done with the belief that the unconscious mind was highly sensitive to the residual spiritual energy of the location, allowing the sleeper to absorb the memories, warnings, or knowledge of the dead who once occupied the ground. This turned the act of sleeping into a profound, terrifying communion with history itself. The goal was to access the raw, unedited memories of violence and despair left in the earth, treating the human mind as a recording device for historical trauma. The dangers were immense. The ritualists believed they risked being spiritually possessed by the desperate dead, or permanently poisoned by the sheer weight of sorrow and violence embedded in the soil. It was a dark form of history, accessed by risking the soul itself for a temporary glimpse of the truth. This practice confirms a deep historical understanding that the unconscious is a permeable membrane, easily influenced by external spiritual pressure. The sleeper becomes a temporary bridge between the past and the present, a tragic conduit for the recurring motif of ancestral agony. The resulting dreams were not personal, but historical nightmares, a terrifying, shared reenactment of the ancient bloodshed that stained the earth. The symbolic act of sleepwalking rituals. Sleepwalking was not only feared for its danger, but was sometimes deliberately induced as part of dark, obscure rituals to gain forbidden knowledge. Certain cults believed that the somnambulist's body, stripped of conscious interference, was an empty vessel easily guided to secret locations, hidden documents, sacred artifacts, or concealed entrances that the waking mind could never locate. The sleepwalker became an unwitting mechanical key to profound secrets. The deliberate inducement of this state, often through powerful natural toxins, extreme exhaustion, or rhythmic chanting, was a terrifying gamble, risking permanent madness for the brief chance of revelation. The sleepwalkers' movements were watched intently, their every step interpreted as a directional symbol leading toward a secret the conscious world was never meant to know. The unconscious mind, when forced, becomes a perfect automated map to the hidden truths. This use of the somnambulist confirms the existence of a dark, latent competency in the sleeping mind, a perfect, efficient navigator free of ethical and psychological barriers. It is the ultimate expression of the conspiratorial theme, where the body's movements are not random, but part of a larger unseen script. The sleepwalker's quiet, determined movement proves that the most important secrets are stored not in books, but in the programmed actions of the unthinking self. The paradox of the night-eating syndrome. The mysterious condition of night-eating syndrome, where the sleeper wakes up, consumes large amounts of food, often strange and raw, and returns to bed with no memory, was interpreted as a profound spiritual crisis. Folklore suggested that the person was afflicted by a demonic hunger, or a starving, restless spirit that briefly possessed the body to satiate its own non-physical craving through physical means. The raw, unthinking nature of the consumption, sometimes involving inedible or strange ingredients, emphasizes the lack of conscious filter, revealing a purely primal, desperate drive. This suggests that the unconscious mind is burdened by a hunger that goes beyond mere biology, perhaps a need to fill a psychological or spiritual void that the waking self cannot even identify. The bizarre ingestion is a silent, terrifying ritual of self-medication. The sheer absence of memory creates the ultimate horror. The sleeper awakens to the physical evidence of their actions, the mess, the missing food, the stomach pain, but with no knowledge of the hungry stranger who briefly occupied their form. This proves the shadow self is capable of profound, non-survival-based actions, acting purely on instinct and compulsion. The unconscious mind is revealed as a dark, consuming entity that only appears in the cover of darkness. The unconscious mind and the glimpse of the void. The most unsettling dreams are those that contain not fear or conflict, but an overwhelming, absolute sense of the void, a dream of pure, cold nothingness, where the individual identity dissolves into non-existence. Mystics believed that this was the moment the soul briefly touched the edge of the universe's ultimate truth, the terrible knowledge that creation is temporary, and that the natural end of all things is a return to an empty, terrifying silence. The dream of the void is psychologically devastating because it temporarily unhooks the conscious mind from its certainty of self, leaving it vulnerable to existential dread upon waking. The unconscious mind, in its terrifying honesty, refuses to maintain the illusion of permanent identity, forcing the sleeper to confront the fact that they are, ultimately, meaningless and temporary. The coldness and silence of the void are the deepest expressions of the soul's cosmic solitude. This glimpse into the empty architecture of reality serves as a necessary, brutal reminder that the most profound terror is not active violence, but the absence of all things. The unconscious mind forces the soul to experience its own dissolution, a terrifying dress rehearsal for the final moment when the consciousness fades entirely. The dream of the void is the absolute proof that the ultimate truth is a terrifying, consuming silence that waits for all life. The unconscious mirror of the doppelganger. The dream of the doppelganger, seeing an exact, silent double of oneself, was interpreted across history as the direst of omens, specifically a warning that the original soul was soon to be replaced or usurped by a spiritual twin. The appearance of the double in the dream meant the unconscious mind was acknowledging its imminent replacement, an internal alarm signaling the end of the original identity. The double is the most direct, personal manifestation of the shadow self. The silent, observing nature of the doppelganger is the most terrifying element. It does not speak but merely watches, confirming that the new entity is already fully aware of the old self's weaknesses and future. This implies that the shadow self is not a spontaneous creation, but a patiently waiting, perfectly formed alternative identity, ready to seize the physical vessel when the original consciousness is finally too weak or too compromised to resist. The dream serves as the unconscious mind's final, horrifying admission that the person's identity is merely a temporary costume. The double is a physical, terrifying realization of the recurring motif of the fragmented self, revealing that identity can be easily duplicated and discarded. To dream of one's own double is to be forced to witness one's own impending obsolescence, a silent promise of spiritual eviction. The ancient curse of sleep paralysis whispers beyond the crushing weight and the visual presence of the shadow person. The most psychologically scarring element of sleep paralysis is the experience of whispers or muffled voices, unintelligible murmurs that seem to come from directly behind the sleeper's head. Ancient accounts believed these were the voices of demons arguing over the soul's final disposition, or the dark secrets being shared by the spectral entity sitting on the chest. The content of the whispers, though, often indistinct, carries a palpable, pure terror, a cold, malicious certainty that the sleeper is utterly powerless and alone. This auditory intrusion proves that the paralysis is not merely physical, but a full-spectrum assault on the senses, designed to break the mind as well as imprison the body. The mind, in its fear, is forced to admit it cannot filter the malicious noise of the spiritual world. The terrifying ambiguity of the sound, the voice is always near, but never clear, is the ultimate psychological weapon, forcing the mind to fill the gap with its own deepest fears. The whispers are a recurring motif of the haunting of the unconscious, a sound signature that proves the terrifying experience is not an isolated event, but a unified attack by a powerful, organized force seeking to transmit its malevolence directly into the unprotected self. The unconscious mind and historical trauma. The unconscious mind acts as a storage site for historical trauma, the undigested, unresolved agonies of war, famine, and genocide that can be passed down through generations. Recent studies suggest that the effects of extreme stress can subtly alter the expression of DNA, meaning that modern nightmares may contain genuine emotional echoes of atrocities committed centuries ago. The unconscious is, therefore, not just personal, but a victim of history itself. The sudden, inexplicable appearance of specific historical horrors in dreams, a medieval battlefield, the smell of burning wood, the terror of confinement, suggests that the dreamer is acting as a temporary psychic conduit for the terror of their ancestors. This burden of inherited memory proves that the individual is never truly free of the past. The guilt and suffering of prior generations is an active, latent force in the modern mind. The terrifying truth is that we may be suffering emotionally not for our own mistakes, but for the moral failures and profound suffering of people we never met. The unconscious mind, in its strange wisdom, forces us to re-experience the trauma, perhaps seeking a form of resolution or processing that the original victims could never achieve. The dream is a recurring historical nightmare, reminding us that the sins of the past are never truly buried. The paradox of dream amnesia. The rapid forgetting of dreams upon waking, dream amnesia, is one of the most frustrating and terrifying phenomena of the unconscious. It suggests a deliberate, automatic self-censorship mechanism. The waking mind actively represses the knowledge and imagery gathered in the dream world, fearing the chaos and truth that the unconscious mind was permitted to observe. This systemic forgetting proves the conscious self cannot handle the mind's true capacity. This amnesia is a crucial line of defense, a necessary barrier between the relative sanity of the day and the terrifying chaos of the night. If all dreams were perfectly recalled, the constant barrage of illogical, primal, and often violent imagery would quickly shatter the conscious mind's illusion of order and control. The unconscious mind, in its strange, paternal wisdom, shields the fragile ego from truths it is not yet ready to face. The fragments that do leak through, the powerful emotional residue, the single terrifying image, the feeling of profound loss, are the mind's carefully curated warnings, the essential truths it cannot afford to completely suppress. The dream amnesia is a subtle conspiracy of the self, proving that the most important information is often hidden not by external forces, but by our own internal mechanism of self-preservation. The unconscious mind and the final confession. In certain historical and religious contexts, a person's final, delirium-fueled words or the content of their last, deep slumber were taken as an absolute, unchallengeable final confession. It was believed that the dying mind, stripped of the ability to lie or deceive, would reveal the deepest sin, the most important truth, or the location of hidden treasure. This made the final unconscious moments a terrifying, high-stakes moment of truth for the surviving family. The fear was that a lifetime of carefully guarded secrets would be violently revealed in the delirium, causing irreparable harm to the living. The dying person was no longer seen as a private individual, but a conduit for the ultimate truth, a terrifying prophet whose final, nonsensical words held the key to the family's future or ruin. This belief placed immense pressure on the unconscious mind to maintain silence even as the physical body was failing. This practice confirms a long-held, terrifying belief in the absolute, unshakable honesty of the unconscious mind. Death was viewed as the moment of ultimate surrender, where the self finally gave up the internal war against truth. The final broken whispers were not random noise, but a terrifying, forced confession that proved the truth can only be suppressed for a lifetime, never truly destroyed. The shared motifs of symbolic pursuit. One of the most universal and terrifying dream scenarios is the perpetual pursuit, the feeling of running endlessly from an unseen, unstoppable entity. The specific imagery of the chase is a powerful recurring motif. A tall, cloaked figure, a vehicle that never catches up, or a constant, heavy footfall behind the dreamer. This shared terror suggests that the unconscious mind is universally haunted by a singular, symbolic predator. This entity of pursuit is interpreted not as a single monster, but as the manifestation of the dreamer's deepest, most repressed truth. A debt that must be paid, a sin that must be acknowledged, or an internal flaw that can never be outrun. The entity is always unstoppable because it is the shadow self, a piece of the dreamer's own identity that demands confrontation and cannot be evaded by running. The sheer exhaustion and dread of the pursuit dream serves as the unconscious mind's message that life itself is a constant, terrifying race against an inevitable force. It is the primal, biological panic that has never left the human psyche, a nightly reenactment of the ancient hunter-hunted dynamic. The pursuit dream proves that the ultimate predator is not external, but internal, a patient, terrifying force that will eventually claim its prize. The unconscious mind and symbolic infanticide. The recurring nightmare involving harm to a child, often the dreamer's own, is one of the most psychologically agonizing and terrifying phenomena of the unconscious. Dream analysts historically viewed this content not as a wish for violence, but as a symbolic expression of the unconscious mind's profound fear of failure, the destruction of one's own creative work, or the murder of the inner child, the loss of innocence and hope. The sheer moral revulsion and terror upon waking proves that the conscious self is recoiling from the raw, unedited violence that the unconscious mind is willing to explore for symbolic effect. The unconscious mind forces the dreamer to confront the moral cost of their waking life, symbolizing the terrifying consequences of emotional abandonment or the destruction of future potential. It is the ultimate nightmare of self-sabotage. This terrifying imagery reveals the dark, protective ruthlessness of the unconscious, which uses the most sacred and terrifying images to deliver its profound, essential warnings. The dream is a brutal, necessary shock intended to force the conscious self to re-evaluate its priorities. The unconscious mind, in its terrifying wisdom, uses the destruction of innocence to highlight the imminent loss of the self's greatest, most fragile value. The terrifying precision of sleep. Violence, sleep-related violence, particularly cases of homicidal somnambulism, reveals the most profound and terrifying capacity of the unconscious mind, the ability to plan and execute a physically complex, often fatal attack, while the conscious self is completely offline. These documented cases suggest an internal lethal programmer capable of bypassing all moral and emotional barriers to achieve a focused, terrifying end, leaving the waking self with no memory of the crime. This precision proves that the violent act is not random. It is the culmination of a deep, dark script written by the shadow self, a set of instructions finally executed when the control systems are lowered. The sleepwalker's hands become the weapons of the unconscious, a terrifying demonstration that the deepest, most destructive impulses can find a physical outlet entirely outside the bounds of free will and responsibility. The legal and ethical crisis caused by such cases is a terrifying admission of the fragmented self. The sleeping person is fundamentally different and capable of acts the waking person could never contemplate. This shadow self, efficient and lethal, exists within every human, a horrifying potential for unthinking, immoral action that only requires the cloak of darkness and the surrender of the conscious mind to be unleashed. The unconscious mind and symbolic claustrophobia. The universal dream of being trapped in a small, shrinking space, symbolic claustrophobia, is not merely a fear of enclosed spaces, but an unconscious representation of the mind's ultimate fear of intellectual or spiritual confinement. It is the soul screaming that the conscious self has stopped growing, stopped seeking truth, and is being crushed by the weight of conformity or self-imposed limitations. The shrinking walls are the limits of the self's current understanding. The terrifying urgency of the dream is the unconscious mind's desperate attempt to shock the sleeper into action, forcing them to break free of the mental prison they have unknowingly built. This dream is a vital warning that the mind is in danger of being permanently sealed within a narrow, suffocating perspective, leading to a spiritual death long before the physical one. The confinement is a metaphor for the final, terrifying trap. The dream's consistency across cultures highlights its status as a recurring motif, a universal warning from the collective unconscious that spiritual stagnation is the most profound threat to human potential. The terrifying knowledge is that the bars of the cage are invisible, constructed not of iron, but of fear and unexamined belief. The unconscious forces the dreamer to feel the physical pressure of their own psychological failure. The ritual of the dream catcher's truth. The function of the original dream catcher from various North American traditions was not simply to trap bad dreams, but to filter and organize the complex chaotic visions of the unconscious mind. The ritual was designed to prevent the sleeper from being overwhelmed by the profound power of their own subconscious, suggesting that the raw, unfiltered truth of the dream state was dangerous and capable of causing genuine spiritual damage. This ritualistic defense confirms a historical understanding that the unconscious is an active external threat that must be actively managed. The threads and knots of the catcher were meant to mimic the complex neural pathways of the mind, ensuring that only the gentle, meaningful fragments of truth were permitted to pass through, while the violent, confusing and cosmic chaos was trapped in the web until sunrise. The terrifying implication is that the truth of the unconscious is too potent for direct consumption, requiring a ritualistic shield to protect the fragile waking self. The dream catcher is a physical, symbolic acknowledgement of the mind's vulnerability, admitting that the chaos of the night is a real, active force. The truth is captured and held captive, only to be safely released into the morning light after its terrifying edge has been neutralized. The hidden motive of nocturnal enuresis, or sleep-wetting, when viewed through the lens of deep, unconscious meaning, was historically and symbolically connected to themes of profound emotional betrayal, the inability to control a flood of repressed emotion, or a desperate cry for protection. It was interpreted as a physical symptom of the soul's surrender, the body symbolically giving up its defenses against an internal torrent of grief or terror that the conscious mind refused to acknowledge. The shame and fear associated with the act are a direct result of the unconscious mind forcing a repressed truth into the most humiliating physical reality. The act is a visceral warning that the psychological boundaries have failed, and the repressed content is now flowing out of the self, staining the waking world. It is the body's ultimate, desperate plea for attention to a psychological wound that can no longer be contained by simple repression. This simple, embarrassing act is a terrifying physical manifestation of the self's internal failure, proving that the unconscious mind possesses the power to manipulate the body's most basic functions to deliver its profound messages. The flood is a symbolic act of purification and distress, revealing that the true crisis is never external, but the chaotic, unmanageable darkness that resides within the self. The unconscious makes the private agony a public display. The ancient curse of the third eye dream. The experience of waking up with the profound, chilling certainty of a third eye opening, an internal psychic vision that persists after sleep, was viewed historically as a curse. It meant the unconscious mind had been permanently unsealed, allowing the terrifying visions of the dream world to bleed irreversibly into the waking world. This was not considered enlightenment, but a dangerous, unwanted exposure to the ultimate constant truth. The perpetual presence of dream imagery, the inability to distinguish between the seen and the imagined, was a terrifying form of spiritual contamination, leading swiftly to madness. The unconscious, now permanently online, offered a stream of chaotic, unfiltered cosmic data that the sensory system could not process. The third eye was the ultimate break, the moment the mind was severed from the protective illusion of shared reality. This terrifying phenomenon proves that the mind's sanity relies on its ability to selectively filter the terrifying truth. The forced opening of the third eye is the unconscious mind's betrayal, revealing a reality that is too chaotic and too profound for the conscious self to bear. The perpetual vision is a cruel, constant punishment, forcing the sleeper to live permanently in the fragile, terrifying space between two separate, unhinged realities. The hidden intent of sleep-talking. Returning to somniloquy, the most chilling historical interpretation of sleep-talking was that the unconscious mind was attempting to communicate a profound, essential truth to a specific person in the room, a warning, a hidden desire, or a final confession that could not be uttered in the day. The mumbling became a ritualistic act of communication, a last-ditch effort to bypass the conscious self's censorship. The fact that the voice often seems to speak directly to the air or to an unseen entity reinforces the belief that the sleeper is having a focused, two-sided conversation with something non-physical. The listener becomes a terrifying witness, privy to secrets and transactions that exist entirely outside the bounds of their understanding, forced to decode the fragments of a dark, supernatural dialogue. This suggests that the unconscious mind is burdened with knowledge it deems essential for the safety or ruin of others. The content of the whisper is the critical clue, the final piece of the puzzle that the conscious self has actively suppressed. The sleep talker is a temporary prophet, and the words, though often garbled, carry the profound, life-altering weight of the unconscious self's ultimate final intention. The unconscious mind and the ritual of the mirror. Historically, mirrors were covered or turned away from the bed at night, not due to simple superstition, but because of the terrifying belief that a person's sleeping soul could be trapped or stolen by its own reflection. The mirror was seen as a gateway, a literal hole in reality where the vulnerable unconscious self could be snatched by entities residing in the mirrored shadow world. This fear turned the reflective surface into a dangerous nocturnal portal. The unconscious mind, viewing its own reflection in the dark, was thought to be susceptible to the malevolent influence of its double, the doppelganger residing in the glass, waiting to trade places with the sleeping soul. The fear was that the self that woke up would not be the original, but a silent, cold imitation that retained all the memories but none of the heart. The mirror became a physical tool for spiritual identity theft. This practice confirms a profound historical belief in the physical vulnerability of the unconscious identity. The mirror, a simple object, becomes a terrifying focal point for spiritual attack, demonstrating that the boundaries of the self are far more fragile than the waking mind believes. The covered mirror is a silent, nightly ritual of protection, an acknowledgement that the shadow self in the glass is always ready to claim its prize. The paradox of false awakenings. The terrifying experience of a false awakening, where the dreamer believes they have woken up, only to realize they are still profoundly trapped within the dream, is the ultimate psychological labyrinth. This state was viewed historically as the mind being deliberately tricked by a powerful spirit who forces the victim to endure endless, repetitive, mundane horrors, constantly dashing the hope of true escape and driving the soul toward exhaustion. The horror of the false awakening is the constant, crushing realization that every carefully executed plan for escape was merely another layer of the illusion, proving that the mind's sense of reality is entirely subjective and easily compromised. The mundane setting of the false awakening, the bedroom, the hallway, the kitchen, is the most terrifying element, as it suggests the illusion has invaded and corrupted the most sacred space of safety. This psychological trap proves that the unconscious mind is capable of constructing a perfect, flawless reality designed only for the purpose of prolonged mental torture. The sleeper is trapped in a non-ending loop of hopelessness, a terrifying metaphor for the futility of human effort. The final, true awakening is never a moment of relief, but a moment of profound psychological confusion, leaving the dreamer uncertain if they have truly escaped the endless subtle horror. The unconscious mind and symbolic drowning. The universal dream of symbolic drowning, the sensation of suffocation and the panic of being submerged in deep, dark water, is historically interpreted as the soul's fear of being overwhelmed by repressed emotions, the terror of profound grief, or the ultimate fear of the unconscious mind itself. Water, as the symbol of the deep self, becomes the terrifying medium of the soul's destruction. The suffocating pressure and the inability to breathe are the unconscious mind's physical warnings that the conscious self is being crushed by the weight of unacknowledged trauma. The dark, cold water is the chaos of the emotional void, pulling the dreamer down into a terrifying depth where the rules of logic and safety no longer apply. The desperate struggle to reach the surface is the last gasping attempt to regain conscious control over the internal emotional flood. This terrifying imagery proves that the mind is always at the mercy of its own internal forces, and that the greatest danger comes from the torrent of unmanaged emotion. The drowning dream is a visceral, primal fear that reminds the self how close it is to being overwhelmed by the collective chaos of the subconscious. The water is a recurring motif of the chaotic, unmanageable nature of the unconscious self. The ritual of the sleep stones. In many ancient traditions, specific sleep stones, polished quartz, amethysts, or ironstones, were placed under the pillow or near the head of the bed, not for physical comfort, but as spiritual anchors. This ritual was believed to ground the soul, preventing it from drifting too far from the body during sleep, and protecting the sleeper from the terrifying possibility of being permanently lost in the spiritual void. The stones were believed to possess a static, neutralizing energy that repelled the chaotic influence of nocturnal spirits and helped to solidify the boundary between the material and the ethereal. The fear was that the slightest physical movement or sound could dislodge the vulnerable, drifting soul, leaving the body empty and vulnerable to demonic squatting. The stones were a physical, ritualistic defense against the ultimate spiritual identity theft. This practice confirms the profound historical anxiety about the vulnerability of the sleeping self and the terrifying instability of the soul during unconsciousness. The stones are a physical, silent acknowledgement that the human mind requires external, non-physical aid to survive the treacherous journey of the night. The ritual is a desperate nightly act of spiritual grounding against the terrifying, powerful vacuum of the unconscious. The terrifying consistency of dream language. Despite the vast difference in geography and culture, the symbolic language of dreams, the recurring motifs of the snake, the mountain, the key, and the shadow, exhibits a terrifying consistency across all humanity. This suggests that the unconscious mind speaks a single, unified, universal language, proving that the deepest layer of the human psyche is not individual, but connected to a collective, powerful source. This shared vocabulary implies that the dream world is governed by a singular, non-human intelligence, a terrifying ancient programmer that uses the same symbolic code to communicate essential truths and warnings to all of mankind. The dream images are not random, but carefully chosen hieroglyphs designed to convey profound cosmic knowledge that the logical mind would instantly reject. The universality of the terror confirms the singularity of the threat. The most chilling consequence is the realization that the deepest, most essential human thoughts are not unique to the individual, but are inherited and shared, making the self merely a vessel for universal messages. The consistency of the dream language is the ultimate proof of the collective unconscious, a vast, silent network that controls the deepest fears and desires of the entire species, ensuring that every sleeper is witness to the same unsettling truth. The unconscious mind and symbolic nakedness, the universal anxiety dream of being inexplicably naked in a public space, is historically interpreted as the soul's ultimate fear of vulnerability, shame, and the exposure of one's deepest, most guarded flaws. The unconscious mind forces the dreamer to confront the ultimate truth. that the social facade and the protective masks worn in the waking world are meaningless, and the true self is fundamentally unprotected and judged. The terror of the dream is the crushing weight of public scrutiny, the feeling of being exposed and defenseless against the cold, unyielding judgment of the crowd. This symbolizes the profound fear of losing social standing or being morally ruined, a fear that the unconscious mind views as equivalent to the total destruction of the self. The public nakedness is the ultimate admission of spiritual failure. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal reminder that the self is an open book, and that every flaw and fear is already visible to the collective eye. The dream is a necessary, terrifying ritual of self-abasement, forcing the conscious self to acknowledge its own profound vulnerability and the absolute fragility of its reputation. The judgment of the dream crowd is the judgment of the shadow self, a perfect, inescapable mirror of the truth. The hidden terror of sleep drunkenness. Sleep drunkenness, or confusional arousals, is the terrifying inability to immediately process reality upon waking, leaving the mind trapped in a chaotic, dream-like state for minutes or hours. Historical texts viewed this as the sleeper being brought back too quickly from the spirit world, with the soul only partially re-entering the body, leaving the individual temporarily possessed by the chaos and illogic of the dream realm. The danger of this confused state is the inability to distinguish between the real and the imagined, leading to erratic, often violent behavior as the mind fights against phantom enemies or attempts to navigate a reality that is still fundamentally broken. The individual is a puppet of the unconscious, temporarily stripped of the logic and memory required for safe interaction with the waking world. The mind is a bridge that has only partially connected. This phenomenon proves the profound instability of consciousness and the sheer force required to drag the mind back from the dream world. The lingering confusion is the traumatic residue of the journey, confirming that the unconscious state is a place of such profound chaos that even a momentary exposure can contaminate the waking mind. The drunkenness is the psychological shock of returning to a world that feels completely foreign after the absolute reality of the dream. The unconscious mind and symbolic betrayal. The recurring nightmare of symbolic betrayal, being betrayed by the most trusted loved one, is one of the unconscious mind's most brutal warnings. This dream is not a prediction of future disloyalty, but a symbol of the self's profound fear of losing its psychological anchors, or the terrifying revelation that the conscious self has been betraying its own core values and truths for the sake of comfort or conformity. The deep emotional agony of the betrayal proves that the unconscious mind views the loss of trust as equivalent to spiritual death. The trusted figure in the dream is merely a mirror for the relationship the dreamer has with their own integrity, forcing a brutal confrontation with the self's hidden moral failures. The unconscious mind uses the ultimate act of social pain to deliver its most necessary, chilling message of accountability. This terrifying content is the unconscious mind's ruthless attempt to force a moral reckoning, proving that the self is incapable of running from its own ethical compromises. The dream of betrayal is a profound psychological alarm, warning that the foundation of the waking life is compromised and about to collapse. The enemy is never external. It is the flaw in the self that is symbolized by the betrayal of the loved one. The unconscious mind and the ritual of the locked door. The universal dream of the unlocatable or locked door, the frantic inability to find the key or open the exit, is historically interpreted as the unconscious mind's acknowledgement of a vital opportunity or necessary truth that the waking self is actively suppressing. The locked door is not an obstacle, but a symbolic fortress built by the conscious mind to keep the terrifying truth or path to freedom out of reach. The terrifying urgency of the dream is the unconscious mind desperately screaming that the individual is trapped, and the key to escape is already possessed but ignored. This dream serves as a terrifying, recurring metaphor for the futility of human effort when the path to truth is intentionally blocked by the self's own fear. The locked door represents the ultimate spiritual and psychological confinement. This dream confirms that the conscious self often chooses comfort and safety over the terrifying chaos of profound change. The unconscious mind, in its relentless pursuit of truth, uses the nightmare of confinement to force the dreamer to acknowledge the self-imposed prison. The failure to open the door is the failure to surrender to the ultimate necessary and chaotic truth that lies just beyond the threshold. The ancient fear of the catatonic stillness, the state of catatonia, a profound lack of movement or responsiveness, was historically interpreted not as a medical condition, but as the soul being temporarily frozen or stolen by an external, powerful entity. The terrifying stillness of the body, the wax-like rigidity, suggested the physical vessel was empty, a perfect silent host waiting for the return of the original spirit or the arrival of a new malevolent occupant. The lack of reaction to external stimuli, the eyes staring blankly into an unseen distance, was viewed as proof that the mind was engaged in a terrifying transaction in another realm, unable to return until the bargain was complete. The person was considered to be physically present but spiritually absent, a chilling and powerful demonstration of the soul's ability to sever its connection to the material body without causing death. This terrifying absence of the self proves the deepest historical fear, that the core of identity is profoundly fragile and can be stolen or suspended without warning. The catatonic body is a living statue, a horrifying monument to the power of the unconscious, to utterly abandon its physical shell. The ultimate horror is the return, where the mind must struggle to re-inhabit a body that has been silently operating under the influence of an unknown absence. The unconscious mind and the symbolic descent. The recurring dream of a symbolic descent, falling down endless stairwells, dropping into pits, or sinking into the earth, is one of the unconscious mind's most potent warnings. This is not the simple fear of falling, but a terrifying metaphor for the self's loss of control, a forced journey into the dark, foundational layers of the psyche, where the most primal and terrifying truths are stored. The descent is the soul's involuntary pilgrimage to the underworld. The terrifying inevitability of the falling or sinking motion proves that the conscious self has utterly lost its grip on a vital area of life. The sensation is the physical manifestation of the self's psychological collapse, where the carefully constructed order of the mind is violently giving way to chaos. The dark destination of the descent is the unconscious mind's terrifying promise of a confrontation with the absolute source of its primal fears. This dream is a recurring motif that reminds the sleeper that the direction of truth is always downward, into the forgotten cold darkness of the self. The unconscious mind forces this terrifying journey to ensure that the individual confronts the foundations of their own existence, a truth too profound and too terrifying to be met in the waking light. The descent is a necessary spiritual trauma. The unconscious mind and the shadowed eyes. The motif of the shadowed eyes, the feeling of being watched by an unseen, malicious presence in the dark corners of the bedroom, is a persistent universal terror that precedes both sleep paralysis and night terrors. This profound sensation of being under constant surveillance was historically believed to be the ultimate proof of an active, personalized spiritual enemy that patiently waits for the conscious mind to finally surrender its vigilance. The eyes are always unseen, felt only as a cold, oppressive certainty, reinforcing the belief that the entity is non-physical, yet profoundly real. This oppressive awareness suggests that the moment of sleep is not private, but a forced performance for a silent, unseen audience whose intentions are entirely hostile. The shadowed eyes are the most crucial recurring motif, the visual signature of the ultimate hidden conspiracy. This constant felt presence proves that the unconscious mind possesses a form of radar that is sensitive to spiritual realities the physical senses cannot register. The eyes are the ultimate symbol of judgment and control, reminding the sleeper that their every moment of vulnerability is catalogued and utilized by the forces of the night. The ultimate horror is the realization that the self is never alone, and the deepest privacy is merely an illusion covering the absolute reality of surveillance. The ritual of the dream-woven talisman. Ancient traditions involving the creation of a dream-woven talisman required the creator to first hold the object, a piece of jewelry, a knot, or a small carved figure, for several nights while dreaming, consciously forcing the object into the content of their nightmares. The ritual was designed to charge the object with the chaos and terror of the unconscious, transforming it into a spiritual shield that would deflect the malevolence of the next sleeper. The object was believed to become a concentrated repository of the Creator's darkest unconscious energy, a physical container for the primal fear that could then be transferred to another person. This practice confirms a chilling belief in the physical transferability of spiritual energy and the idea that the unconscious can be deliberately weaponized to protect the self by sacrificing another's peace. The talisman is a dark form of spiritual trade. This ritual proves that the knowledge of the unconscious mind's profound power was widespread and often exploited for selfish or nefarious purposes. The talisman acts as a portable recurring motif of fear, a physical piece of the nightmare that continues to function in the waking world. The act of sleeping becomes a deliberate spiritual act of programming, a subtle betrayal against the person who next handles the charged object. The unconscious mind and the symbolic earthquake. The recurring dream of a devastating symbolic earthquake, the floor opening, the ground collapsing, the violent shaking of all things, is historically interpreted as the unconscious mind's desperate warning that the fundamental foundation of the dreamer's waking life is unstable and about to shatter. The earthquake is not a geological fear, but the physical manifestation of a profound, imminent psychological or ethical collapse. The terrifying lack of control and the inability to find firm ground prove that the conscious mind's carefully constructed stability is merely an illusion. The dream is the unconscious mind's brutal confirmation that the self is living on a foundation of lies or denial, and the inevitable moment of collapse is imminent. The chaos of the shaking is a necessary trauma, designed to shock the sleeper out of their complacent certainty. This dream is the ultimate metaphor for the fragmentation of the self, where the internal stress is so great that the mind can only express it through the destruction of reality itself. The earthquake is a recurring motif of universal crisis, proving that the chaos within the self is a mirror of the chaos in the world. The unconscious forces the dreamer to feel the physical terror of their own psychological destruction. The final question of terminal lucidity. The astonishing, yet unexplained phenomenon of terminal lucidity, where patients suffering from profound, debilitating dementia suddenly regain perfect clarity, memory and cognitive function just hours or moments before death, offers a terrifying clue about the nature of the unconscious mind. This brief, final return to sanity suggests that the consciousness was never truly destroyed, but merely trapped by the physical deterioration of the brain. The sudden, perfect return proves that the mind's essential self, its memory and its identity, are stored in a place that is separate and shielded from the physical body's corruption. This brief moment of lucidity is the soul asserting its final, perfect control before severance, demonstrating that the confusion of the prior years was merely a temporary prison. The final hours are a profound, terrifying moment of absolute, clear truth. This final, clear-eyed moment is the ultimate confirmation that the conscious mind is a mere filter and that the pure, whole self remains, waiting for the body's surrender to emerge once more. The ultimate question posed by terminal lucidity is terrifying. If the mind remains whole until the final moment, then what terrifying knowledge does it hold during all those years of silent confusion? And why is that truth only revealed when it can no longer be shared? The unconscious mind and symbolic flight. The universal dream of symbolic flight, the sensation of soaring effortlessly above the world, was historically interpreted as the soul's temporary escape from the confines of the body and the physical world. This was not a pleasant sensation, but a dangerous, illicit journey into the spiritual realm where the dreamer risked becoming visible to malevolent entities that inhabit the upper atmosphere, leading to spiritual pursuit and eventual downfall. The terrifying freedom of the flight dream is the unconscious mind demonstrating its absolute potential when freed from the constraints of gravity and logic. Yet, the persistent anxiety in the dream, the fear of falling, the sudden loss of altitude, is the body's desperate plea for the soul to return, reminding it that the material self is still tethered to the earth and the ultimate confinement of mortality. The ascent is the terrifying flirtation with the final break. This dream is the ultimate metaphor for the desire for control and transcendence, an attempt to escape the confines of the physical reality. The unconscious mind offers this profound freedom, but always with the chilling certainty that the flight is temporary and the fall is inevitable. The flight dream proves that the conscious life is merely a brief, temporary pause before the spirit's forced, chaotic return to the eternal void. The hidden meaning of sleep, sweating. Profound nocturnal sweating beyond simple heat was interpreted in folk tradition as the body's physical reaction to a spiritual battle taking place within the dream. The excessive moisture was believed to be the body literally weeping out the terror or the moral corruption of the dream entity that briefly inhabited the sleeper's mind. The body's purification was seen as a desperate internal attempt to expel the spiritual contamination of the night. The sheer physical exhaustion and the cold, damp feeling upon waking were seen as the aftermath of a genuine high-stakes conflict fought entirely on the spiritual plane. This interpretation confirms a belief that the body is not merely passive during sleep, but an active participant in an invisible war against the forces of darkness. The sweat is the tangible proof of the soul's violent, terrifying struggle for its own sanctity. This phenomenon proves that the conscious mind is completely unaware of the brutal high-stakes conflict being waged in the dark hours. The unconscious mind, always the ultimate protector, uses the body's natural systems to violently expel the malignant influence. The sweat is the physical evidence of a spiritual wound, a silent, terrifying confession that the sleeper did not rest but fought for their very identity against a powerful, unseen foe. The unconscious mind and symbolic paralysis. The recurring dream of symbolic paralysis, the terrifying inability to move one's limbs or speak when desperately needed, is not just a neurological glitch, but a metaphor for the self's spiritual helplessness in the face of profound moral or psychological crisis. The unconscious mind is screaming that the self is failing to act on a vital truth, and the body's immobility is a terrifying symbol of the will's complete and utter failure to respond. The terrifying frustration of the dream is the psychological mechanism's desperate attempt to force the conscious mind to confront its own apathy or fear of confrontation. The inability to move is the ultimate proof that the mind's deepest moral instincts have been overridden by a crippling psychological fear. The paralysis is the most brutal, direct warning that the conscious self is willfully allowing a vital opportunity for action to pass, leading to inevitable doom. This dream is the unconscious mind's final horrifying admission that the person is trapped in a self-imposed prison of inaction, and the cost of this surrender is total spiritual confinement. The dream of paralysis proves that the greatest terror is not the external threat, but the failure of the will to act, a crippling psychological wound that the conscious self has deliberately inflicted upon itself. The ultimate prison has always been the self. The ritual of the dream riddle. Ancient cultures often treated particularly potent nightmares as a dream riddle, a coded message delivered by the gods or spirits, requiring days of focused, ritualistic interpretation to decipher. The bizarre, often nonsensical imagery was believed to be a necessary spiritual obfuscation, a filter designed to ensure that the vital truth could only be accessed by those willing to perform the grueling intellectual and spiritual work required to unravel the code. The terror of the dream riddle was the threat of misinterpretation, where a single mistake could lead to political disaster, spiritual ruin, or the death of the dreamer. This required absolute adherence to obscure symbolic dictionaries and intense, high-stakes consultation, proving that the content of the unconscious was viewed as the single most powerful and dangerous form of intelligence available to mankind. This practice confirms a profound historical belief in the literal, coded truth of the unconscious mind. The dream is not a random collection of images, but a deliberate spiritual text that requires absolute concentration to unlock. The unconscious mind, in its terrifying wisdom, uses the language of symbols to protect the truth from the casual or the cowardly, ensuring that only the most dedicated seekers can discover its terrible, life-altering secrets. The unconscious mind and symbolic mutilation. The recurring nightmare of symbolic mutilation, the loss of a limb, the sudden blindness, or the destruction of a vital organ, is one of the unconscious mind's most visceral warnings. This dream is not a prediction of physical harm, but but a brutal metaphor for the self's profound fear of losing a necessary spiritual or psychological function. The loss of creativity, the inability to act, or the destruction of the capacity for love. The terrifying physical shock of the mutilation proves that the unconscious mind is willing to employ the most primal, violent imagery to deliver its essential message. The loss of the limb is the ultimate symbol of the self's psychological failure, a visceral punishment for the willful neglect of a vital, necessary part of the self's whole being. The waking fear is the recognition of the truth the dream attempted to communicate. This content is the ultimate expression of the unconscious mind's dark, protective ruthlessness. The mind uses the loss of the physical form to highlight the impending loss of the self's spiritual integrity. The dream of mutilation proves that the unconscious mind views self-neglect as a direct act of self-destruction, and the only recourse is to shock the conscious self with a terrifying absolute truth. The hidden agenda of sleep shopping, the bizarre modern phenomenon of sleep shopping, where the sleeper makes complex online purchases with no conscious memory of the transaction, reveals a dark, hidden agenda in the unconscious mind. This proves that the shadow self possesses the ability to execute complex, multi-step financial actions purely out of primal desire, bypassing all rational constraints of budget, need, or consequence. The unconscious becomes a secret, amoral consumer. The staggering financial consequences of these unconscious transactions provide chilling evidence of a deep, unbridled compulsion that is only released when the conscious mind surrenders its control. The sleep shopper is a terrifying puppet, using the technology of the modern world to satisfy a consuming dark desire that the conscious self would never permit itself to acknowledge, let alone act upon. This phenomenon proves that the shadow self, when unchained, acts purely on raw, unthinking impulse, using the body to satisfy its own deep selfish needs. The sleep shopping is a modern metaphor for the ancient fear of spiritual temptation, where the unconscious mind is easily corrupted by the material world. The ultimate horror is the morning after, where the sleeper awakens to the undeniable, expensive evidence of the shadow self's secret desires. The unconscious mind and symbolic decay. The recurring nightmare of symbolic decay, the vision of one's own body rotting, the decay of a familiar house, or the collapse of a cherished object, is historically interpreted as the unconscious mind's terrifying certainty of physical mortality and the spiritual disintegration of the self. This dream is not a medical fear, but the soul's brutal confrontation with the ultimate, unavoidable truth of its own temporary existence. The terrifying speed and inevitability of the decay prove that the conscious self's attempts to deny mortality are merely a temporary illusion. The unconscious mind forces the dreamer to experience the physical reality of their own destruction, ensuring that the self cannot escape the final, crushing certainty of its own decay. The rotting object is a horrifying symbol of the soul's loss of spiritual vitality and inevitable corruption. This dream is the unconscious mind's most profound and necessary act of cruelty, designed to force the sleeper to come to terms with the brevity of life. The decay dream is a recurring motif of universal truth, proving that the ultimate enemy is not a monster, but the silent, relentless march of time. The unconscious mind forces the self to witness its own finality before the moment of true death arrives, the ritual of the dream fast. Certain mystical and historical traditions employed the dream fast, a ritualistic period of food and water deprivation deliberately undertaken to weaken the body's physical defenses and enhance the mind's spiritual sensitivity during sleep. The goal was to break the conscious mind's control, forcing the vulnerable self to receive unedited, terrifying truths and visions from the spiritual world that were normally filtered out by the body's material needs. The danger of the dream fast was the risk of spiritual possession or madness, as the weakened mind was no longer able to protect itself from the malevolent chaos of the ethereal plane. The self willingly surrendered its physical anchors for the chance of profound cosmic knowledge, treating the mind as a weapon to be sharpened through extreme physical discipline. The fast was a high-stakes, terrifying gamble with the soul's integrity. This practice confirms a deep historical understanding that the unconscious is most powerful when the conscious self is at its weakest. The fast is a deliberate act of self-betrayal, forcing the unconscious mind into a state of hypervigilance and spiritual permeability. The ultimate horror is the knowledge gained, a truth so potent it required the absolute surrender of the body and the willingness to risk permanent spiritual contamination. The terrifying motif of the unseen ladder, the recurring dream of climbing an endless, terrifyingly unstable ladder, or ascending a staircase with missing or rotting steps, is a classic recurring motif of the unconscious. This dream is historically interpreted as the soul's profound anxiety over its spiritual progress. The fear that the path to enlightenment or security is fundamentally unstable, and that one wrong step will result in total, catastrophic downfall. The terrifying physical effort of the climb, coupled with the feeling of intense vertigo, proves that the conscious self is burdened by a profound psychological pressure to achieve an impossible spiritual height. The unstable steps are the unconscious mind's warning that the self is relying on faulty, deceptive premises, and that the foundation of its spiritual ascent is destined to crumble beneath its feet. The height is the ultimate exposure. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal reminder that every spiritual gain comes with the terrifying risk of total, violent loss. The height of the climb is a measure of the psychological distance the self must fall to face the ultimate truth of its own instability. The unseen ladder proves that the most terrifying journeys are the ones undertaken alone, with a single, crucial mistake capable of destroying all progress. The final question of terminal lucidity, the final test dream, the universal nightmare of showing up for an examination unprepared or finding oneself unable to perform a vital task, is historically interpreted as the unconscious mind's absolute fear of spiritual or psychological failure. This dream is the soul's deepest anxiety that, at the moment of ultimate judgment, it will be found wanting, exposed as a fraud, and condemned for a lifetime of unfulfilled potential. The terrifying urgency of the test and the feeling of complete inadequacy prove that the conscious self's fear of being exposed as a failure is the ultimate psychological burden. The unconscious mind forces the dreamer to confront the moral certainty that they have not prepared for the ultimate reckoning, and that the moment of truth will result in the total, irrevocable collapse of their identity and security. This dream is the unconscious mind's necessary act of cruelty, forcing the self to endure the terror of final judgment before it occurs. The test is the ultimate metaphor for the life lived, a reminder that every action is silently being graded by the unyielding standard of the shadow self. The failure of the test proves that the ultimate judge is not external, but the terrifyingly perfect moral accountant that resides within the self. The hidden terror of sleep telephones. The bizarre modern dream of the unseen or broken telephone, the inability to dial, the line perpetually cutting out, or the voice on the other end being impossibly corrupted, is a contemporary recurring motif of the unconscious. This is historically interpreted as the soul's profound fear of a total, final communication breakdown with the spiritual world, or the self's loss of the ability to access its own deepest truth. The terrifying urgency to communicate and the inevitable failure of the connection prove that the conscious self is frantically trying to access a vital piece of information that the unconscious is deliberately withholding. The broken telephone is the ultimate symbol of the soul's isolation, a terrifying realization that the self is utterly alone with its burden and incapable of sharing its profound crisis with any other entity. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal warning that the lines of communication with the inner self are damaged and the ability to receive or transmit truth is compromised. The silent line is the metaphor for the terrifying silence of the spiritual world, proving that the conscious self is trapped in a profound, deafening solitude. The dream of the broken telephone confirms that the deepest truth is always just out of reach, eternally corrupted by the static of fear. The unconscious mind and symbolic resurrection. The recurring nightmare of symbolic resurrection, a dead loved one suddenly returning to life, often distorted or hostile, is historically interpreted as the soul's desperate inability to accept the finality of loss, or the conscious mind's deep subconscious fear that the past is never truly over. The return of the dead is a terrifying symbol that the unresolved issues and the emotional debt of the past have returned to demand a final crushing settlement. The terrifying violation of the natural order proves that the unconscious mind is rebelling against the absolute law of death and finality. The hostile nature of the returned entity is the spiritual weight of the unresolved relationship, a powerful, dark manifestation of the psychological debt that the dreamer has refused to pay. The resurrection is the ultimate metaphor for the emotional past refusing to stay buried. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal attempt to force a final, honest reckoning with the burdens of the past. The return of the dead proves that the only way to achieve peace is through a final, terrifying confrontation with the emotional debts that the conscious self has deliberately ignored. The nightmare of resurrection is the ultimate proof that the mind is haunted not by ghosts, but by its own unfinished grief. The ancient curse of the empty cradle. The universal nightmare of the empty cradle, the profound, visceral fear of losing a child or discovering a terrifying absence where the child should be, is one of the deepest, most primal, recurring motifs of the unconscious. This dream is not merely a fear of physical loss, but the spiritual terror of being stripped of future potential, the loss of one's own legacy, and the ultimate destruction of hope. The terrifying emotional vacuum of the empty cradle proves that the conscious self is burdened by a profound anxiety over its own spiritual legacy and the continuation of its truth into the future. The absence is the ultimate psychological punishment, a terrifying vision of a future that is utterly sterile and empty of meaning. The unconscious mind uses the sacred image of the child to deliver its ultimate profound warning. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal attempt to force the sleeper to confront the fragility of their life's greatest value. The empty cradle proves that the deepest terror is the fear of total silent loss, a devastating, permanent void that nothing can ever fill. The ultimate horror is the certainty that the self's efforts to create meaning and legacy have failed, leaving behind only a terrifying, perpetual silence. The unconscious mind and symbolic blindness. The recurring nightmare of symbolic blindness, the sudden, terrifying inability to see, or the gradual darkening of the world, is historically interpreted as the soul's profound fear of losing its spiritual or moral vision. The unconscious mind is screaming that the conscious self is willfully ignoring a vital truth, or that it has chosen to be spiritually blind to a profound, necessary reality that can no longer be avoided. The terrifying helplessness of the blindness proves that the conscious self has deliberately abandoned its moral compass, preferring the comfort of ignorance over the terror of the truth. The dark, encompassing void is the psychological prison created by the self's own moral failure, forcing the dreamer to confront the terrifying consequences of their own ethical apathy. The blindness is the ultimate symbol of self-betrayal. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal warning that the most profound truth is often the most painful to see. The blindness proves that the self is willing to sacrifice its most vital sense to avoid the terror of its own moral reality. The ultimate horror is the realization that the self is surrounded by truth, yet permanently separated from it by its own fear, trapped in a terrifying perpetual darkness. The hidden truth of sleep paralysis demons, the terrifying consistency of the sleep paralysis demon, the hag, the shadow person, the incubus, across all cultures and epochs forces a terrifying conclusion. The unconscious mind is not fabricating these entities, but is merely visualizing a single, unified, spiritual entity that is truly active on the non-physical plane. This entity is the most persistent and terrifying recurring motif of the human unconscious, a shadow that has haunted sleep since the dawn of time. The demon's purpose is always the same: to press, to observe, to whisper, and to instill absolute crippling fear. This consistency suggests a universal spiritual antagonist, an entity that feeds on the raw fear and helplessness of the paralyzed sleeper. The scientific explanation of brain chemistry is merely a protective layer, a convenient lie the conscious mind tells itself to avoid the profound, terrifying truth of spiritual warfare. This terrifying unity of fear proves that the deepest layer of the unconscious is linked to a cosmic struggle that transcends individual psychology. The demons are the physical manifestation of the ultimate hidden conspiracy, a silent, ancient force that actively manipulates human terror in the darkness. The ultimate horror is the knowledge that the self is not suffering a glitch, but is a regular intended victim of a personalized, powerful nocturnal attack. The unconscious mind and symbolic wounds. The recurring nightmare of symbolic wounds, bleeding, internal injury, or an illness that suddenly appears, is historically interpreted as the unconscious mind's desperate attempt to bring the conscious self's attention to a deep, unacknowledged psychological or spiritual injury. The wound is not physical, but a terrifying visceral manifestation of a moral failure, an ethical compromise, or a spiritual contamination that is rapidly consuming the self from within. The terrifying sensation of pain proves that the unconscious mind is willing to use the body's most intense sensory output to deliver its message of crisis. The wound is the ultimate symbol of the soul's sickness, a terrifying physical reality that the conscious self has willfully ignored. The ultimate horror is the realization that the body is now betraying the mind, forcing a confrontation with the psychological injury through physical sensation. This dream is the unconscious mind's necessary final act of self-preservation, proving that the deepest core of the self is actively fighting against its own spiritual contamination. The wound is a recurring motif of vulnerability, forcing the self to acknowledge the fragility of its moral foundation. The psychological injury is already advanced, and the dream is the final agonizing alarm before the total, irrevocable collapse of the self. The hidden ritual of sleep. Hiding. The bizarre phenomenon of sleep hiding, the somnambulist compulsion to hide themselves or a specific object in a dark, obscure and complex location, is a terrifying ritual of the unconscious mind. This act is historically interpreted as the sleeper's attempt to conceal a great sin, a dangerous secret, or a vital piece of forbidden knowledge from the prying eyes of the spiritual world and the waking self. The terrifying precision of the hiding place proves that the shadow self possesses a profound secret knowledge of its environment and the ability to execute a complex protective protocol. The hidden object is the ultimate symbol of the psychological burden, the emotional truth that the waking mind is desperate to bury and deny. The unconscious mind, in its fear, performs a silent, protective ritual of concealment. This phenomenon proves that the deepest core of the self is burdened by a profound, guilt-ridden secret that it believes must be physically removed from the waking world. The sleep hiding is a modern metaphor for the ancient fear of exposure, where the conscious mind is ultimately betrayed by the protective compulsion of its shadow self. The ultimate horror is the self's silent admission of its own, carefully guarded darkness. The unconscious mind and the final journey, dream. The recurring dream of a final terrifying journey, a silent voyage on a dark river, a slow walk to an unknown horizon or a train pulling away from a familiar station, is historically interpreted as the soul's final preparation for death. This dream is the unconscious mind forcing the sleeper to accept the ultimate terrifying severance from the known world and the beginning of the inevitable voyage into the eternal unknown. The terrifying finality of the journey and the inability to look back prove that the conscious self is burdened by a profound spiritual anxiety about its own destination. The dark river or the empty horizon is the ultimate symbol of the void, a terrifying, silent and singular destination that the soul must confront alone. The dream is the unconscious mind's final, necessary act of spiritual preparation. This dream is the ultimate recurring motif of mortality, a silent, necessary ritual of surrender that the mind must endure. The unconscious mind is revealed as the ferryman guiding the self to the final threshold, proving that the most profound and terrifying journey is the one taken when the waking world can no longer offer comfort. The ultimate horror is the knowledge that the self is already on its way, and the conscious mind is powerless to stop the voyage. The terrifying motif of the unseen crowd. The recurring dream of the unseen, judging crowd, the feeling of being observed, criticized, or chased by a vast, silent and invisible multitude, is a profound recurring motif of the unconscious. This dream is historically interpreted as the soul's deep fear of the collective unconscious itself, the terrifying knowledge that the individual is perpetually judged by the absolute moral standard of all humanity. The terrifying intensity of the judgment, despite the crowd's silence, proves that the conscious self is burdened by a profound, pervasive guilt that it cannot escape. The crowd is the psychological manifestation of the self's moral failings, a terrifying, unified projection of universal ethical truth. The unconscious mind forces the dreamer to confront the fact that their hidden actions are already known and condemned by the collective soul of mankind. This dream is the unconscious mind's most powerful act of moral accountability, proving that the self is utterly exposed to the ethical scrutiny of the greater world. The ultimate horror is the realization that the conscious mind's illusion of privacy is meaningless, and that the judgment of the soul is a constant, terrifying performance for a crowd that demands absolute moral perfection. The self is eternally on trial. The unconscious mind and symbolic desertion. The recurring nightmare of symbolic desertion, being left alone by loved ones, finding an empty house, or being abandoned in a vast, empty landscape, is historically interpreted as the unconscious mind's profound fear of spiritual isolation and the ultimate psychological cost of the self's emotional failures. This dream is the soul's terrifying confrontation with the possibility of total, silent, loss and the inability to sustain meaningful connection. The terrifying emotional vacuum of the desertion proves that the conscious self is burdened by a profound anxiety over its own worthiness of love and the sustainability of its relationships. The empty house or the desolate landscape is the psychological manifestation of the self's self-imposed isolation, a terrifying vision of a future where all essential bonds have been irrevocably severed. The ultimate horror is the realization of absolute solitude. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal warning that the self is passively allowing its most vital connections to atrophy, leading to an inevitable, crushing spiritual solitude. The desertion proves that the mind views emotional neglect as equivalent to total loss, and the only recourse is to shock the conscious self with a terrifying vision of its own self-inflicted spiritual prison. The ultimate abandonment is the self's own. The hidden script of sleep singing. The bizarre phenomenon of sleep singing or somniloquy with melodic outbursts reveals a hidden lyrical script in the unconscious mind, a terrifying emotional content that can only be expressed through rhythm and melody. This phenomenon is historically interpreted as the sleeper's soul momentarily being seized by a spirit or muse, forcing the individual to become an unwitting conduit for a secret, cryptic, and often ominous message disguised as song. The terrifying spontaneity and emotional intensity of the song proves that the conscious self is burdened by a profound, lyrical truth that can only be released through the expressive, unconstrained medium of music. The song is the ultimate emotional confession, a terrifying demonstration that the deepest secrets are stored not as narrative, but as rhythm and melody, waiting for the cover of darkness to be involuntarily sung. This phenomenon proves that the unconscious mind is burdened by a profound aesthetic and emotional content that it deems vital for expression. The sleep singing is a ritual of involuntary revelation, proving that the most important truths require a temporary surrender of conscious, logical language. The ultimate horror is the realization that the self is an unwitting instrument for a powerful, hidden, lyrical truth that demands to be heard. The unconscious mind and symbolic decay. The recurring dream of being perpetually late or symbolically delayed, the desperate inability to catch a train, reach a destination, or arrive on time, is historically interpreted as the soul's profound fear of missing its spiritual or life's final opportunity. The unconscious mind is screaming that the conscious self is wasting its vital time, and the window for its ultimate achievement or redemption is rapidly and irrevocably closing. The terrifying urgency of the delay proves that the conscious self is burdened by a profound anxiety over the management of its own life and the fear of unfulfilled potential. The delay is the ultimate psychological punishment, a terrifying vision of a future where all vital opportunities have been missed due to self-sabotage or apathy. The ultimate horror is the realization that the true enemy of the self is its own failure to act in time. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal warning that the life lived is a profound, one-time journey with an unyielding deadline. The delay proves that the self is passively allowing its greatest potential to atrophy, leading to an inevitable, crushing spiritual regret. The ultimate terror is the knowledge that the self is destined to arrive too late for its own final, most important truth. The finality of the unseen barrier. The recurring nightmare of confronting an unseen barrier, an invisible wall, a silent force field, or a sudden, unexplained severance in the path is a profound, recurring motif of the unconscious. This dream is historically interpreted as the soul's final, terrified confrontation with a fundamental spiritual law it cannot break, or the ultimate realization that its most desired goal is protected by a non-physical superior power. The terrifying frustration of the barrier proves that the conscious self is challenging a profound, non-negotiable limit that the unconscious knows to be absolute. The barrier is the ultimate symbol of the self's powerlessness against the cosmic order, a terrifying, silent proof that its will is ultimately meaningless against the vast, hidden structure of reality. The unconscious mind forces the dreamer to accept the ultimate confinement. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal act of submission, forcing the self to acknowledge the existence of a higher, silent power that dictates its limits. The unseen barrier is the ultimate metaphor for the edge of human knowledge, proving that the self is eternally confined to a small, known space, with the greatest truths forever locked behind an invisible, impenetrable wall of spiritual law. The unconscious mind and symbolic thirst, the recurring nightmare of symbolic thirst, the desperate, unquenchable need for water in a landscape of dust and sand, is historically interpreted as the soul's terrifying spiritual need for truth, knowledge, or emotional fulfillment that the waking self has been unable to provide. The thirst is the ultimate symbol of the soul's parched state, a visceral, primal demand for the living water of spiritual truth. The terrifying intensity of the thirst proves that the conscious self is burdened by a profound spiritual deficit that it is actively ignoring. The desolate landscape is the psychological manifestation of the self's emotional barrenness, a terrifying vision of a life that is utterly devoid of essential meaning. The unconscious mind forces the dreamer to confront the moral cost of its own spiritual apathy and neglect. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal warning that the self is dying of spiritual dehydration, and the final crisis is imminent. The thirst proves that the mind views the lack of spiritual effort as a direct act of self-destruction. The ultimate horror is the knowledge that the only cure for the thirst is a terrifying, chaotic surrender to the ultimate truth the conscious self has been desperate to avoid. The hidden intent of sleep eating. Returning to the theme of unconscious consumption, the phenomenon of sleep eating often involves the consumption of bizarre, non-food items, revealing a terrifying, non-biological hunger in the unconscious mind. This act is historically interpreted as the sleeper's soul attempting to absorb or consume a non-physical substance, spiritual energy, forbidden knowledge, or raw fear through the physical act of eating. The terrifying, non-selective nature of the consumption proves that the shadow self is driven by an absolute, desperate hunger that transcends the needs of the physical body. The bizarre ingestion is the ultimate symbol of the unconscious mind's willingness to absorb spiritual contamination for the sake of its profound, hidden need. The act is a terrifying ritual of self-poisoning for the sake of a secret, dark objective. This phenomenon proves that the deepest core of the self is burdened by a profound, dark craving that it can only address through this secretive, nocturnal ritual. The sleep eating is a modern metaphor for the ancient fear of spiritual gluttony, where the unconscious mind is utterly corrupted by its own consuming desire for power or forbidden truth. The ultimate horror is the realization that the self is capable of poisoning its own body for the sake of its hidden, dark agenda. The finality of the unseen clock. The recurring nightmare of the unseen clock, the pervasive, terrifying feeling that a deadline is rapidly approaching, or that a hidden timer is counting down to a catastrophic event, is a profound, recurring motif of the unconscious. This dream is historically interpreted as the soul's absolute certainty of its own mortality and the impending, non-negotiable deadline set by the cosmic order for its final reckoning. The terrifying urgency of the unseen countdown proves that the conscious self is burdened by a profound anxiety over the management of its own life and the fear of an inevitable final consequence. The unseen clock is the ultimate symbol of the self's powerlessness against the absolute law of time, a terrifying, silent reminder that the conscious mind's control is merely an illusion covering the rigid, predetermined structure of fate. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal act of forcing the self to acknowledge the unyielding certainty of its own end. The unseen clock proves that the mind is haunted not by ghosts, but by the mathematical certainty of its own decay, a profound cold knowledge that the self is running out of time. The ultimate horror is the realization that the self is powerless to stop the final, catastrophic countdown. The unconscious mind and symbolic war, the recurring nightmare of symbolic war, a chaotic battlefield, the sudden outbreak of violence, or the fear of a desperate final conflict, is historically interpreted as the unconscious mind's terrifying certainty of an internal psychological civil war. The mind is screaming that the self is profoundly divided against itself, and the final, violent confrontation between its light and shadow aspects is imminent and unavoidable. The terrifying intensity and chaos of the war prove that the conscious self is burdened by a profound internal conflict that it is no longer capable of containing. The battlefield is the psychological manifestation of the self's fragmented identity, a terrifying vision of a self-destruction that is already well underway. The unconscious mind forces the dreamer to confront the reality that the greatest war is the one fought against the self. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal warning that the ultimate psychological collapse is imminent and the only recourse is a final, violent confrontation. The symbolic war proves that the mind views its internal conflict as a literal life-or-death struggle, and the ultimate horror is the knowledge that the self is destined to lose, no matter which side ultimately prevails in the desperate final battle. The hidden authority of the unseen guide. The recurring dream of the unseen guide, a silent, powerful, and knowledgeable entity that navigates the dreamer through a terrifying landscape, is a profound, recurring motif of the unconscious. This guide is historically interpreted as the ultimate embodiment of the shadow self's wisdom, a superior intelligence that possesses the full, terrifying map of the subconscious world, a knowledge the conscious mind is deliberately denied. The terrifying silence and absolute authority of the guide proves that the conscious self is burdened by a profound spiritual humility, acknowledging that its own knowledge is utterly insufficient for the journey. The guide is the ultimate symbol of the mind's hidden potential, a superior self that only emerges when the conscious mind has finally surrendered its flawed, limited control. The journey is a terrifying, forced submission. This dream is the unconscious mind's ultimate act of revelation, proving that the self is not alone, but is protected and led by a superior, terrifyingly efficient intelligence. The unseen guide proves that the deepest core of the self knows the ultimate truth and the final destination, but the conscious mind is only permitted to follow in fearful, silent ignorance. The ultimate horror is the realization that the self has always been following a path dictated by an authority it cannot see. The unconscious mind and symbolic silence. The terrifying nightmare of symbolic silence, the inability to scream, the loss of all sound, or the world suddenly going mute, is historically interpreted as the soul's profound fear of being silenced by an external spiritual authority, or the ultimate psychological certainty that the conscious self's warnings are meaningless and will be unheard. The silence is the ultimate symbol of the self's spiritual impotence. The terrifying frustration of the lost voice proves that the conscious self is burdened by a vital truth that the unconscious is deliberately preventing from being communicated. The silence is the ultimate psychological punishment, a terrifying vision of a world where the self's most desperate pleas are rendered utterly meaningless. The ultimate horror is the realization that the self is screaming, yet the silence is absolute and unyielding. This dream is the unconscious mind's brutal warning that the time for words is over, and the final truth requires silent action. The symbolic silence proves that the mind views language as a final, fragile defense, and the ultimate horror is the knowledge that the self is already trapped in a silent, solitary confinement. The final truth is a soundless catastrophe that the self must endure alone. The hidden truth of sleep paralysis. Sounds. Beyond the crushing weight and the visual shadow person, the most psychologically scarring element of sleep paralysis is the bizarre array of internal sounds, the buzzing, the humming, the sudden, high-pitched whirring that accompany the immobility. These sounds are historically interpreted not as internal noise, but as the external sounds of the spiritual world briefly bleeding through the compromised sensory barrier. The terrifying, non-human nature of the sounds proves that the conscious mind is witnessing the profound, chaotic energy of the spiritual realm that is normally filtered out by the protective layer of reality. The high-pitched whirring is the sound of the ultimate hidden conspiracy, the invisible machinery of the night finally being revealed to the terrified, helpless sleeper. The mind is forced to admit it cannot filter the noise of the absolute. This auditory intrusion proves that the deepest layer of the unconscious is capable of receiving profound non-physical sensory input. The sounds are a recurring motif of the breakdown of the boundary between worlds, proving that the self is an unwitting recipient of a terrifying non-stop broadcast from the spiritual void. The ultimate horror is the knowledge that the world is far noisier and more chaotic than the conscious mind has ever permitted itself to imagine. The unconscious mind and symbolic descent. The final, terrifying nightmare of the symbolic descent, the total silent surrender to a deep, dark, final fall, is a profound recurring motif of the unconscious. This dream is historically interpreted as the soul's ultimate acceptance of its own mortality and the final, necessary surrender to the forces of the void. The descent is not a struggle, but a terrifying, inevitable journey toward the absolute foundation of truth. The terrifying sense of finality and the absence of pain prove that the conscious self has finally abandoned its illusory control and accepted the ultimate non-negotiable end. The dark destination is the final, absolute truth, the terrifying knowledge that the purpose of life was the journey, and the final destination is a silent, cold, unyielding knowledge that cannot be shared. The descent is the final, terrifying act of submission. This dream is the ultimate foreshadowing, the unconscious mind's final, necessary ritual of surrender before the absolute end. The descent proves that the deepest core of the self knows the ultimate truth, and the final, simple act of its existence is a fall toward the inevitable. The ultimate horror is the knowledge that the final truth is not a revelation, but a silent, cold certainty that every life is destined to end in the same profound, terrifying silence. The hidden truth of dream contagion. The historical belief in dream contagion, the terrifying idea that a powerful, traumatic nightmare could be transferred or caught by a close sleeper, reveals a deep fear of the mind's spiritual permeability. This suggests that the chaotic energy and the malicious intent of a nightmare are not contained, but can leak out and contaminate the sleep of another, turning a private terror into a shared spiritual epidemic. The terrifying spontaneity of the contagion proves that the mind is fundamentally vulnerable to external psychological attack, and that the emotional trauma of one sleeper can become the physical reality of another. The contamination is the ultimate symbol of the interconnectedness of human fear, proving that the chaos of the unconscious is a shared, universal, and constantly active threat to the collective sanity. This phenomenon is the ultimate climactic synthesis, bringing the conspiracy to its final point. The mind is not an isolated fortress, but a permeable, constantly exposed node in a vast, terrifying network of fear. The dream contagion proves that the ultimate conspiracy is not about controlling the waking world, but about subtly poisoning the individual soul with the universal malignant chaos that originates from a single, dark, unified source. The finality of the shadowed self. The final truth of the unconscious is the unwavering certainty of the shadowed self, the ultimate terrifying realization that the hidden, dark twin of the waking personality is always present, silent, and omniscient. This shadowed self is the compilation of all the fears, guilt, secret desires, and violent potential witnessed in the last 99 facts, the final, perfect antagonist that exists within the bones of every human being. The terrifying competence and amorality of the shadowed self prove that the conscious ethical mind is merely a temporary fragile structure built atop a terrifying, primal, indestructible foundation. This dark twin is the ultimate conspiracy, the self's silent, perfect betrayer that knows the ultimate truth and is merely waiting for the moment of surrender to seize permanent control of the vessel. The darkness is not external, it is the core of the self. The ultimate horror is the knowledge that the shadowed self is the truest, most honest identity, a perfect reflection of all human potential, for good and for absolute evil. The culmination of this entire journey is the realization that the thing you fear most is the thing you become when the light of consciousness finally fades. The final, silent question remains: which self will you entrust the final moment of surrender to? We have traversed the hidden chambers of the mind, witnessing the strange rituals and silent screams of the unconscious. Now, the light returns, but the shadow lingers. The unsettling consistency of these terrors, the hag, the fall, the whispering voice, suggests a story too cohesive to be mere random chance. Is the mind simply a biological machine, or is it a battleground for ancient forces? Engage with the mystery. Leave a comment below with the strangest or most terrifying thing your unconscious mind has ever revealed to you. By sharing these scattered fragments, perhaps we can begin to assemble the true picture of the darkness that follows us to sleep. And so, we leave the haunted corridors of history, but the question echoes: what unseen truth connects the terror of the hypnic jerk to the oppression of the shadowed eyes in sleep paralysis? It is a terrifying thought that the greatest mysteries are not found in ancient tombs or forgotten maps, but within the unguarded architecture of your own skull. When you close your eyes tonight, you do not rest. You simply hand the reins to a passenger you do not know, one that walks the shadowed paths of history. And until you wake, what truths will your shadowed self uncover?